I was sitting in a highly exclusive members-only oil club in downtown Dallas, watching my mother swirl her expensive champagne. She flashed a warm, desperate smile at my younger brother's future father-in-law, and then with a perfectly manicured French tip finger, pointed straight at me. "This is our oldest, Elena," she told the table, her voice dripping with this sickeningly sweet fake sincerity. "She fixes broken computers and runs internet cables for a living." My father let out a soft chuckle, adding that they had pretty much given up on my future a long time ago. The table went completely dead silent. The father of the bride-to-be, a high-powered senior partner at one of the top corporate law firms in the country and a former federal judge, tilted his head and locked his intense eyes right onto me. "Wait," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Aren't you the—" I met his gaze and gave him a tiny, almost invisible shake of my head. He cut himself off mid-sentence, a flash of pure shock and sudden realization crossing his eyes. Then a slow, calculated smile spread across his hardened, weathered face. "My name is Elena, and I am 35 years old. For years, I let my family believe that I was just a struggling, bottom-tier hardware repair tech working out of basements. In reality, I had secretly built a multi-million-dollar empire specializing in corporate cybersecurity and data infrastructure. To understand how we ended up at this disastrous engagement brunch, you have to understand the toxic dynamic of my family. We grew up in the wealthy enclave of Highland Park, Texas, and for my parents, Arthur and Eleanor, keeping up appearances was absolutely everything. They lived for country club memberships, predatory luxury car leases, and the illusion of old money. My 28-year-old brother, Julian, was their prized masterpiece. He was the golden child, coddled from birth and packaged as a tech prodigy and crypto entrepreneur, completely shielded from the harsh realities of the world. I was the exact opposite. I was independent, practical, and I couldn't care less about their shallow, materialistic lifestyle. When I was 20, my parents forged my signature on legal documents behind my back. They took the only property my late grandmother had left me, a small house meant to help me start my business, and mortgaged it to the bone. They used that $150,000 to cover Julian's massive out-of-court settlement from a drunk driving incident and to fund his hopelessly doomed startup. When I found out, I felt like the world was collapsing around me. I confronted them, but my mother just self-righteously told me that someone had to make a sacrifice for the family name. She said I was young and could always just take out student loans. I chose not to fight a losing battle of emotional attrition. I packed a few bags, moved into a cheap motel, and scraped by scraping together old server parts and setting up local networks for small businesses. Over the next 15 years, my parents proudly told everyone in their superficial social circle that I was a dead-end, blue-collar worker crawling through dusty air vents to pull wires. They never bothered to check in on me. Because of that, they never knew that my humble repair shop had evolved into Aegis Quantum Solutions, an industry titan that manages core data links and high-level cybersecurity for federal agencies and multinational conglomerates. Which brings us back to the private dining room at the club. Julian's fiancée, Chloe, was 29 and an incredibly sharp, no-nonsense CPA working as a senior M&A auditor at a Big Four firm. She came from a family of self-made legal and financial professionals. Her father, Marcus, was 58, a legal powerhouse with sharp intuition and zero tolerance for fraud. I liked them both instantly. My parents, on the other hand, were desperately trying to impress them. They ordered the most expensive items on the menu, bragged about a completely fictional friendship with the governor, and hyped up Julian's decentralized finance hedge fund. Julian sat next to Chloe in a custom suit he definitely couldn't afford, playing the part of the successful, devoted young fiancé perfectly. I was only invited to serve as a prop. My mother needed me there so that, by comparison, Julian would look even more extraordinary. Throughout the appetizers, Eleanor kept dropping passive-aggressive digs about my outfit, my posture, and the fact that I was single. I just smiled, calmly cutting into my Texas ribeye. Then came the main course, and my mother decided to establish total dominance. She leaned forward, placing her hand on Marcus's arm. "Marcus, we are just thrilled about Chloe and Julian." My mother's voice echoed through the private room. "He has always been the most ambitious child in our family, a true visionary." Marcus gave a polite smile, taking a sip of his sparkling water. "What about you, Elena?" Marcus asked, turning his sharp gaze toward me. "Julian mentioned you work in tech support?" Before I could even open my mouth, my mother let out an exaggerated sigh. "This is our oldest," Eleanor announced to the whole table, her voice dripping with undisguised contempt. She fixes broken computers and runs internet cables for a living. We always encouraged her to get a community college degree, but some people just lack ambition. My father, Arthur, laughed as he cut into his lamb chops. We've pretty much given up on her, he added cheerfully. But hey, someone's got to do the dirty work in the crawl spaces, right? Chloe looked physically uncomfortable. She shifted uneasily in her seat, her brow furrowing as she looked back and forth between me and my parents. As an auditor who valued facts and fairness, watching parents humiliate their own daughter in public deeply bothered her. But it was Marcus's reaction that changed the entire trajectory of the luncheon. Marcus froze. He slowly set his glass down, his sharp eyes locking onto my face before drifting to my well-tailored but extremely understated dark gray cashmere blazer. As a senior partner handling multi-billion-dollar corporate mergers, Marcus's network was deep. Just last week, my company, Aegis Quantum, had signed a confidential 9-figure contract with his law firm to secure and encrypt their nationwide client data network. We hadn't met face-to-face during negotiations, but my face was plastered right on the cover of the due diligence report he had personally signed off on. "Wait," Marcus said, leaning in, his voice dropping low. "Aren't you the—" I met his eyes. The air in the room instantly grew heavy. My mother looked confused, her fake smile freezing on her face. I knew exactly what Marcus was about to say. He was about to reveal my identity as the CEO. He was about to rip away the cover I had carefully maintained. I looked Marcus dead in the eye and gave him a firm, unmistakable shake of my head. It was a silent, absolute command. Do not say it. Marcus was a master at reading a room. He saw right through my parents' smug expressions, Julian's fake elitism, and my absolute calm. In a fraction of a second, he processed the entire dynamic of this toxic family. The truth clicked in his mind, and a slow, brilliant, almost predatory smile spread across his face. He leaned back elegantly in his chair and picked up his napkin. "Aren't you the one who upgraded the entire smart security infrastructure for the Arlington family estate?" Marcus said, seamlessly pivoting the conversation by throwing out the name of an old money family in his social circle. "I heard you did an incredible job. Any honest living made with your hands deserves respect, Eleanor. You should be proud of her for being self-sufficient." My mother's face flushed red with irritation. Marcus defending me was completely off her script. "Oh, well, yes," Eleanor stammered. "But we just wish she would channel her intelligence into a real career path like Julian." I raised my wineglass slightly toward Marcus in a silent toast. He responded with a microscopic, knowing nod. In that split second, a silent alliance was formed between us. The rest of the lunch was a masterclass in suffocating awkwardness. Julian, desperate to get the spotlight back on him, took over the conversation. He started bragging about his wedding plans, dropping heavy hints about renting out the Apex Tower, the premier glass dome venue in downtown Austin. He went on and on about how it was the most high-tech, luxurious landmark in the state, entirely unaware that the building he was talking about had been bought outright by my company 30 days ago to serve as our new Southwestern Data Command Center. Chloe stayed quiet, her eyes darting toward her father. She clearly sensed that Marcus knew something she didn't. The way she looked at Julian now had a new, cautious skepticism to it. The fake facade my family had built was already beginning to crack, and I was more than happy to sit there, finish my creme brulee, and watch them lay the groundwork for their own spectacular downfall. The waiters cleared the dessert plates, leaving only the faint clinking of crystal glasses and the low murmur of other guests in the dining room. Julian took advantage of the quiet moment to launch into another long monologue about his venture capital fund. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and leaned closer to Chloe, making sure Marcus could hear every single word. "I'm just incredibly passionate about disrupting traditional financial systems," Julian said, his face flushed with excitement as he gestured wildly. "The core of my hedge fund is all about synergy and the vertical integration of underlying blockchain logic. We are projecting massive capital returns for our investors by Q3. In this economic climate, scaling a decentralized brand requires true vision." He was stringing Silicon Valley buzzwords together like cheap plastic beads. Anyone with an ounce of real business experience could tell he was just reciting talking points from a third-rate business podcast, without understanding how capital markets actually work. I slowly sipped my Cabernet, keeping my face completely blank. It took me 15 years of dealing with my family's insults to build this bulletproof armor. Denying them any kind of emotional reaction was my own quiet, non-negotiable victory. Chloe gave Julian an encouraging smile, but I noticed a tiny twitch near her eye. As a senior M&A auditor, she spent her days picking apart incredibly complex corporate financial statements and tax compliance issues. She grew up in an elite household that valued academic rigor above all else. There was no way she didn't realize Julian's buzzwords were total nonsense, but she loved him. Or rather, she loved the fictional version of Julian he had sold her on, and that version was unraveling fast under her father's sharp gaze. Marcus wasn't blinded by affection. The seasoned legal titan rested his chin on his interlaced fingers, his expression sharp and analytical. He nodded politely at Julian's endless rambling, but his eyes kept drifting back to me. My mother, completely oblivious to the silent judgment radiating from Marcus, decided this was the perfect moment to step on me to elevate her golden boy. Running a financial firm requires a very rare high-level intelligence, Eleanor announced loudly, reaching over to pat the back of Julian's hand. Julian has had that drive since he was a kid, unlike some people who are perfectly content making minimum wage breathing in dust in other people's basements. Arthur chuckled, swirling his club soda. The world needs ditch diggers too, Eleanor. We accept Elena's mediocrity. A heavy, suffocating awkwardness settled over the table. Chloe cleared her throat, visibly shocked by my parents' casual cruelty. She opened her mouth, likely to change the subject or defend me. But Marcus beat her to it. Marcus didn't even look at Arthur or Eleanor. He ignored them completely, locking his piercing gaze right onto me. "You know, Elena," Marcus said, his voice steady and deliberate, "since you spend so much time dealing with infrastructure, I'm curious about your professional opinion. My firm is currently evaluating a data compliance overhaul for a portfolio of older commercial buildings in downtown Dallas. We've run into endless structural issues and local zoning laws. Trying to retroactively fit a server cooling system that meets federal data protection standards into a 1980s building without violating historical preservation codes has been an absolute nightmare. Have you encountered anything like that in your line of work?" My parents exchanged a confused look. They clearly thought Marcus was mocking me, asking a lowly cable puller about incredibly complex corporate compliance and engineering retrofits. Eleanor opened her mouth, ready to apologize for my inevitable ignorance. But I didn't give her the chance. I set my wine glass down and looked Marcus dead in the eye. "Historical preservation codes are incredibly rigid," I replied, my tone casual but my words perfectly precise. However, the City Council just passed an amendment to Section 7 of the zoning regulations last month. If you classify the server cooling retrofit as a critical infrastructure reinforcement instead of a commercial facility upgrade, you can bypass the Historical Board's initial review process entirely. On top of that, if your firm leverages the federal green energy tax credits, you can offset about 20% of the retrofitting costs. The trick is making sure your contractor uses closed-loop liquid-cooled microcabinets. They require minimal structural invasion and instantly satisfy the board's visual compliance guidelines. Dead silence followed. Julian stared at me, his mouth slightly open. My parents looked like I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. They couldn't wrap their heads around why the daughter they had treated like garbage for over a decade possessed this level of highly specialized, high-stakes expertise. Chloe bolted upright, her eyes glued to me. Her auditor instincts instantly caught fire. She took in my well-tailored blazer, analyzed my effortless composure, and quickly processed the $1 million piece of corporate compliance advice I had just casually dropped over dessert. The confusion in her eyes was quickly turning into an intense, burning curiosity. Marcus let out a deep, booming laugh. It was the first genuine emotion he had shown all afternoon. "Is that so?" Marcus's eyes gleamed with absolute triumph. Section 7. "You're exactly right. First thing Monday morning, I'm having my legal team look into that loophole. That is an incredibly sharp insight for someone who just fixes computers." I gave him a polite, modest smile. "You tend to learn a few things when you build from the ground up," I replied. The silent alliance between Marcus and me was permanently cemented in that moment. He knew exactly who I was. He knew I was the CEO of Aegis Quantum Solutions. He knew the federal contracts I held were worth more money than my parents could make in 10 lifetimes. Most importantly, he knew I was biding my time, waiting for the perfect moment to deliver the final blow. Eleanor, furious that I had somehow won the approval of her powerful future in-law, immediately tried to take back control of the narrative. Elena likes to read a lot of tech magazines while she's waiting for the bus, Eleanor snapped, waving her hand dismissively. Let's not get sidetracked. Julian, tell Marcus about that new capital project you're launching next month. Julian eagerly grabbed the lifeline, launching right back into his nonsense about decentralized nodes and liquidity pools. But the dynamic at the table had shifted irreversibly. Marcus wasn't listening to Julian anymore, and Chloe was no longer looking at her fiancé with blind adoration. Chloe kept throwing calculated sideways glances my way. She was putting the pieces together. If my parents were lying this massively about my intelligence and career, what else were they lying about? And what kind of man was Julian to sit by and let his family humiliate his own sister like this? I leaned back in my chair, completely at peace. My parents thought they were using this dinner to lock down a wealthy marriage for their golden child. They had no idea they had just personally invited a Trojan horse to the table. As the luncheon wrapped up, I knew exactly what was coming next. The waiter was walking toward our table with a black leather folder, and I could already see Julian shifting his jacket, getting ready for his signature vanishing act when the bill arrived. I caught Marcus's eye one last time. We both knew the real show was about to start. The waiter approached the table with the posture of someone delivering a royal decree. He held a sleek black leather book, which at an establishment like this usually meant an astronomical total. We had enjoyed flown-in a 5 Wagyu, rare white truffles, and a vintage champagne my father had insisted on ordering to impress the future in-laws. I knew the pricing of this menu by heart. I also knew the final total was easily going to clear $5,000. The waiter placed the leather book precisely in the dead center of the table. For a long time, nobody moved. The rich aroma of high-end food and expensive perfume hung heavy in the air. My father cleared his throat, suddenly finding the restaurant's ceiling architecture fascinating. My mother took a slow, deliberate sip of her ice water. It was the classic family standoff. They loved playing billionaires, but they despised actually footing the bill. Julian let out a dramatic gasp. He snatched the leather book, opened it, and widened his eyes in a rehearsed display of shock. $5,200, he whispered loudly enough for the neighboring tables to hear. He immediately reached into the inner pocket of his custom suit. I watched him pull out his wallet, his fingers fumbling inside. His breathing quickened, perfectly mimicking a panic attack. "Oh my God," he stammered, pulling out his phone and tapping furiously on the screen. "My bank just sent me an alert. They froze my primary card. Because I put down a massive wedding venue deposit this morning, they flagged it as suspicious activity." He looked at Chloe with innocent, victimized eyes. "Babe, I am so embarrassed. My accounts won't be unlocked until Monday morning." Chloe didn't hesitate, reaching into her purse. "I've got it, Julian. Don't worry about it." But my mother stepped in. Eleanor slammed her hand on the table, her rings clinking sharply against the wood. "Absolutely not, Chloe. Your family is our most honored guest today. We would never let our future daughter-in-law pay for her own engagement luncheon. We are a traditional family with standards." Chloe looked relieved but slightly confused. "If you insist, Mrs. Miller." My father, Arthur, leaned forward. He snatched the leather folder right out of Julian's hands and with a swift, aggressive motion, slid it straight across the table. It zipped over the white tablecloth, stopping just inches from my plate. "You crawl through server rooms for wealthy people every day, Elena," Arthur said loudly, his voice dripping with venom. "Your rich clients must give you plenty of cash tips. Go ahead and cover this for your brother. Consider it your wedding gift to him, since you won't be able to afford anything on their registry anyway." Eleanor nodded aggressively, a malicious glint in her eyes. "Exactly. You don't have a husband, you don't have a mortgage, and you live in a cheap motel. You don't have any real expenses. Be a good sister for once in your life and handle this." The sheer audacity of the demand hung thick in the air. They were actively humiliating me in front of high society, treating me like a human ATM, while simultaneously mocking my supposed poverty. Julian sniffled, squeezing out a fake tear, waiting for me to pull out a crumpled wad of 20s and beg the waiter for a payment plan. They wanted to break me. They wanted Chloe's family to see me as a pathetic, subservient outcast. I didn't even blink. I didn't argue. I maintained cold, flawless eye contact with my father. I slowly reached into my handmade, bespoke suit jacket and pulled out a slim card holder. I don't carry cash, and I don't carry standard plastic credit cards. I slid out a sleek, solid titanium JP Morgan Palladium card. It was a legendary black card, restricted to an internal, invite-only circle of ultra-high net worth individuals with millions in corporate spending. It was heavy, cold, and its distinct metallic sheen was unmistakable. I dropped the card right on top of the bill inside the leather folder. The heavy metal hit the wood through the leather, making a sharp, solid clank. Marcus sat up instantly, his eyes locking onto the dark piece of metal. As a top-tier attorney dealing with high-level corporate finance, he knew exactly what that card meant. He knew the staggering annual fees and the horrifying amount of liquid assets required just to hold that piece of titanium in your hand. He looked up from the card to me, that cold, intimidating smile returning to his face with full force. He recognized power, and he was watching me wield it. Chloe leaned forward too, her sharp auditor's brain working at lightning speed. She recognized the card instantly. The confusion on her face was replaced by absolute shock. She looked at the heavy titanium, looked at my parents, and then looked right at me. Her brain was short-circuiting, trying to reconcile the narrative of a broke basement tech with a woman who threw down a palladium card to clear a $5,200 bill without blinking an eye. My parents, completely ignorant of high-end financial instruments, just saw a dark piece of metal. Eleanor let out a sharp scoff, crossing her arms and rolling her eyes. "I just hope that prepaid debit card of yours has enough of a balance on it," she said. "I'd really hate for us to be further embarrassed by a declined card in a place like this." I gestured to the waiter, who had been keeping a discreet distance a few steps away. He hurried over, picked up the folder, and instantly felt the unusual weight of the card. His eyes widened slightly. Suddenly, his entire posture shifted into one of absolute deference. "I will process this for you right away, ma'am," he said softly, quickly turning on his heel to handle the transaction with the highest priority. I stood up from the table, smoothing down the front of my suit jacket. Looking down at my family, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold sense of detachment. "Dinner is taken care of," I said, keeping my voice smooth and controlled. "Congratulations on the engagement, Julian. I'm sure your wedding will be a truly unforgettable event." Chloe bolted upright in her seat, her mouth opening to speak. "Elena, wait, how do you—" I didn't give her the chance to finish. Turning my back on my stunned family, I gave Marcus a polite nod of respect and strode out of the private dining room. As I walked out of the restaurant, my heels clicked rhythmically against the Argentine marble floor. I stepped into the cool, early autumn Dallas breeze, leaving Chloe to wrestle with her growing suspicions, and my parents completely oblivious to the corporate empire they had just deeply insulted. The crisp air hit my face as I handed my valet ticket to the attendant. Taking a deep breath of the cold night air, I felt the suffocating weight of that dining room completely melt away. I had just set off a chain reaction that would inevitably tear down every single lie my family lived by, and all I felt in that moment was pure, absolute clarity. Before the valet could even turn to fetch my car, the brass and glass doors of the restaurant swung open behind me with a loud thud. Julian marched onto the sidewalk, his expensive leather dress shoes stomping aggressively against the pavement. He had left Chloe and our parents inside, clearly unable to handle losing the last word on this night. He yanked at his tie, glaring at me with narrow, furious eyes. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" Julian hissed, closing the distance between us. "Throwing down some flashy corporate expense card to pay the bill. Mom and Dad might not understand how corporate accounts work, but I do. I know that's just a corporate card a client gave you so you can buy cheap bulk cables and server coolant. You probably just maxed out your company's entire annual budget just to show off in front of my future father-in-law." I looked at my brother, genuinely amazed by his desperate need to diminish my worth. He was drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of undisclosed debt, trying to marry into the wealth of a top-tier auditor and her family, yet he still felt entitled to look down on me. I didn't bother correcting his assumption about the palladium card. Let him believe whatever he wanted if it helped him sleep at night. "Why did you follow me out here, Julian?" I asked, my voice completely devoid of emotion. He scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "Because since you insisted on making a scene tonight, you can make it up to me by doing something actually useful for the wedding." I waited in silence. I knew whatever came out of his mouth next would be incredibly brazen, but I still underestimated his deep-rooted sense of privilege. "We booked the Apex Tower for the wedding and the reception," Julian announced, tilting his chin up with extreme pride. He paused, clearly waiting for me to gasp in awe. The Apex Tower was legendary in Texas. It was an ultra-modern glass skyscraper in the dead center of downtown Austin, featuring suspended gardens and a holographic projection dome that represented the pinnacle of luxury and tech. It was the premier venue for the ultra-wealthy, requiring a massive deposit and years on a waiting list just to secure a date. "The place is incredibly high-end and exclusive," Julian continued, leaning in a bit closer. "And the new management is insanely strict about the technical standards of the venue. They require the building's data network and security monitoring to be at an absolute military-grade level of stability before the wedding crew can even load in. Chloe's family is already paying a fortune for the high-end catering, so the least you can do is pull your weight." I stared at him, my expression completely blank. "Are you asking me to do the IT infrastructure and network operations for your wedding venue for free? I am ordering you to bring your little cable-pulling crew and move into the tower 3 days before the wedding," Julian corrected me sharply. "You need to do a full network sweep and data reinforcement for the grand ballroom, the bridal suite, and the observation terrace. And obviously you're doing it pro bono. Consider it your duty as a sister, since we all know you can't afford anything on my actual registry anyway." The sheer irony of the demand hit me like a physical wave. Julian was standing on a Dallas sidewalk, trashing my life while demanding I provide free manual labor to wire a multi-million-dollar venue just so he could play the part of a billionaire groom. He was completely clueless. He had no idea that 30 days ago, Aegis Quantum Solutions had executed a hostile takeover of the conglomerate that previously owned that tower. He had no idea I was the one who personally signed the hundreds of pages of acquisition documents. He had no idea that the insanely strict new management he was talking about was me. Aegis Quantum literally owned the Apex Tower. I owned the ballroom he wanted to dance in, the bridal suite his fiancée would get ready in, and every single glass floor panel and fiber optic cable he planned to step on. Looking at my brother's face, twisted with arrogance and greed, a brilliant and chilling strategy formed in my mind. If I refused, he would run back to our parents crying about how ungrateful I was. If I argued, he would play the victim. But if I agreed, I would have absolute legitimate control over the entire wedding venue. I would control the chessboard completely. A slow, dark smile spread across my face. It was the kind of smile that usually sent a cold shiver down the spines of my corporate competitors, but Julian was too self-absorbed to sense the danger. "You're absolutely right, Julian," I said, my voice smooth as silk. "Family comes first, and I want your wedding to match exactly what you deserve. I'll make sure my team is there personally. We will do a very thorough sweep of the building." Julian looked slightly surprised by how easily I gave in, but his inflated ego quickly wiped away any suspicion. He smirked, adjusting the lapels of his suit jacket. "See, that wasn't so hard," he said condescendingly. "Just remember to use the freight elevator at the back of the building. I don't want Chloe's family seeing my sister carrying cables around the venue like a janitor. You're just there to work, Elena. Stay out of sight." "I promise you I will stay completely out of sight," I said softly, until the perfect moment. The valet pulled my car up to the curb. He stepped out of a sleek, custom, all-black Porsche Panamera, leaving the high-performance engine purring quietly. Julian's brow furrowed as his eyes locked onto the luxury machine, his brain clearly short-circuiting trying to calculate how a cable tech could afford a vehicle like this. He opened his mouth to say something, probably assuming I had stolen it from a client. I didn't give him the satisfaction of an answer. I handed the valet a crisp $100 bill, slid into the driver's seat, and closed the door. I rolled down the heavily tinted window just a fraction of an inch. "I'll see you at the Apex Tower, Julian. I promise you it's going to be a day you'll never forget." I rolled up the window, shifted into drive, and pulled away from the curb, leaving him standing on the sidewalk, shivering in the cool Texas autumn air. As I drove through the bright city streets toward my penthouse, my brain completely shifted from defense to offense. Julian thought he had just bullied a blue-collar worker into giving him free labor. He had no idea he had just handed the keys to his entire facade directly to the executioner. My parents had stolen my future, belittled me, and used me for 15 long years. Now they were about to willingly walk into a trap built by their own vanity, right inside a fortress that I owned. The stage was finally set. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows of my corner office on the 40th floor of the Aegis Quantum headquarters. I sat behind my polished obsidian desk, reviewing the final asset transfer and operational integration files for the Apex Tower. The acquisition was fully complete. The property was now legally under my corporate umbrella, and my physical security and network teams were already monitoring the premises around the clock. Everything was running with absolute precision. Suddenly, my personal phone buzzed on the desk. I glanced down at the screen. The caller ID showed my mother's name. Eleanor rarely called me unless she wanted to look down on me or needed to wring something out of me. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, hit the answer button, and put the phone on speaker. "I need your social security number, and I need you to send an electronic signature to my email immediately," Eleanor said, completely skipping any greeting and barking out orders like a drill sergeant. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather executive chair, my eyes scanning a multi-million-dollar vendor contract on one of my monitors. "Good morning, Mother. What exactly is so urgent that you need my highly sensitive personal information?" "Don't use that condescending tone with me," Eleanor snapped. The background noise on her end filled with the rustle of clothing and hectic chatter. "Julian found a premier overseas wedding planner with a holographic projection package, and he's getting Chloe a custom gown flown in straight from Paris. It is going to be absolutely breathtaking, and it will show Marcus's family exactly what level of son-in-law they are getting." "And what does Julian's gown and projector have to do with my signature?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "The planning company and the bridal boutique require a co-signer for the financing plan," Eleanor explained, her voice dripping with impatience. "All of Julian's capital is currently tied up in his blockchain projects, and your father and I are moving some offshore investments around to cover the high-end imported flowers. The total bill comes out to $150,000. The financing company needs a second signature today to push the approval through. Since you don't have a mortgage and barely have any real expenses, your credit score should be clean enough to act as a subprime cosigner," Eleanor added. I let the sheer insanity of her request hang in the air for a moment. My mother was aggressively demanding that her allegedly broke bottom-tier repair tech of a daughter co-sign a $150,000 loan, all just so her golden boy could lease a day's worth of pure vanity. The absolute financial delusion of my family had officially reached psychotic levels. "I'm not signing any financial guarantees, Mother," I replied smoothly. "If Julian can't come up with $150,000, maybe he should manage his expectations and find a venue that actually fits his budget." Dead silence gripped the other end of the line for a fraction of a second before Eleanor completely exploded. "You selfish, ungrateful little leech," Eleanor screamed, her screeching voice echoing off the walls of my sprawling office. "You owe your brother. When you dropped out of school to mess around with your garbage electronic parts, you became a total embarrassment to this family. We've had to endure the humiliation of admitting to all of our friends that our oldest daughter is a dead-end cable puller. This is the absolute least you can do to make up for the shame you brought onto this house." I stopped reading my contract. I placed my pen flat on the desk. The cold, analytical executive in my brain locked onto its target. "I didn't drop out," I said, my voice dropping an octave, cutting through her hysterical tirade like a razor blade. "I was forced out by the university administration because my tuition check bounced." "You just couldn't handle the academic pressure," Eleanor scoffed, trying to rewrite history the exact way she always did. "Do not gaslight me, Mother." "We both know exactly what happened," I shot back, leaving zero room for argument. "I had a half-tuition scholarship. I was counting on the trust fund my grandmother legally left in my name to cover my housing, my textbooks, and the rest of my tuition. But when I went to the bank during my sophomore year to pay the university bill, the account had been completely wiped clean." I paused, letting the reality of the crime marinate. "You and Arthur forged my signature," I continued, coldly stating the facts. "You illegally bypassed the trust restrictions and drained every single penny of that $150,000. You stole my college fund to pay for Julian's massive out-of-court settlement from his freshman DUI and reckless driving crash. You bled my future dry to fund his bankrupt garbage startup so he wouldn't look poor in front of his fraternity brothers. You left me completely penniless on the street, stuck with an eviction notice from my dorm, and a mountain of university debt I had no way to pay off. That is why I was forced to fix abandoned hardware. I had to scavenge for parts in hazardous scrapyards just to buy groceries while you paraded Julian around the country club." "You are twisting the past," Eleanor shouted, but her voice was trembling with panic as her deepest sins were dragged into the light. "Julian needed those funds to maintain his social status. He was networking with important people. Your computer theory stuff was totally useless anyway. Someone had to sacrifice for the family. We did what we had to do to protect Julian's future." And I did what I had to do to survive the future you destroyed, I fired back flawlessly. You made your choice 15 years ago. You chose to sacrifice me to fund his delusions. Now you don't get to come back and demand my credit score to pay for his wife's wedding dress. If you don't sign these loan documents right now, you are officially banned from the wedding reception, Eleanor threatened, pulling out her favorite weapon. You are strictly forbidden from using anything but the freight entrance at the Apex Tower. Once you finish running the network cables, you get the hell out through the back door like the hired help you are. As far as this family is concerned, you are dead to us. I looked around my immaculate executive suite. I looked at the legal deed to the Apex Tower sitting directly on my desk. I'm not signing a thing, I said, my voice sounding like pure ice. Good luck with the dress, Mother. I tapped the screen, ending the call. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. The emotional wounds my parents inflicted on me had scarred over and turned into steel years ago. All I felt now was a clinical, icy determination to drive this game to its inevitable, destructive conclusion. I leaned forward and pressed the intercom on my desk. Go ahead, boss, Vance, my chief of security, answered instantly. Vance, I said, my eyes locking onto the city skyline outside my window. I need you to put the highest level of security freeze and deep hardware tracking on my personal social security number and all of my private credit profiles immediately. Flag any hard inquiries as a red alert straight to my phone. Are we expecting a specific threat? Vance asked, his tone instantly shifting into high alert. My family is desperate for $150,000, and they have a history of financial forgery, I explained calmly. If they can't bully me into signing, they might be stupid enough to try and steal my identity to get the money. Understood. I'm putting a total lockdown on it right now, Vance confirmed. I released the intercom. My parents thought they were still dealing with the helpless, broken 20-year-old girl they had robbed 15 years ago. They were about to find out exactly what kind of monster they had created in the dark. 2 days after locking down my credit files, a notification lit up the screen of my encrypted work phone. It was a text from an unknown number, but the grammar was precise and highly formal. Elena, this is Chloe, Marcus's daughter. We need to talk privately. Julian has no idea I'm contacting you. Name a time and a place. I smiled, leaning my phone against the mahogany desk. The sharp senior auditor was finally putting the pieces together. I texted her back with the address of an incredibly discreet private cigar lounge located in the absolute heart of the Dallas financial district. It was a place reserved for billionaires and elite executives to hold confidential business meetings, somewhere Julian and my parents could never dream of sneaking into. The next morning at 10 sharp, I arrived at the lounge. Chloe was already sitting in a secluded leather booth near the back, slowly nursing a cup of black coffee. She looked completely exhausted. The radiant, confident bride-to-be I had seen at the engagement brunch was entirely gone. In her place was a trained CPA whose professional instincts were screaming that she was being conned. I walked over to the booth in a perfectly tailored charcoal power suit, radiating an effortless air of authority. Chloe stood up out of pure habit, though her dark eyes were filled with fatigue and wariness. I slid into the booth across from her, crossing my legs and folding my hands over the immaculate marble tabletop. Chloe decided to skip the pleasantries completely. My fiancé told me that the black card you used at the restaurant was a prepaid corporate expense card, Chloe started, her voice low and tight. He claims it was given to you by a client to purchase bulk fiber optic cables and coolant. I let out a tiny mocking breath but said nothing. As an auditor who specializes in mergers and acquisitions for high net worth clients, Chloe continued, leaning forward. I know exactly what a JP Morgan Palladium card means. I know the spending threshold. I know the annual fee. You don't get a card like that by running Ethernet cables in basements, Elena. I kept my expression completely neutral. You have excellent observation skills, Chloe. Chloe ran a hand over her face, frustration breaking through her professional veneer. Your parents treat you with absolute disdain. Julian talks about you like you're a pathetic stray dog. They openly humiliated you in front of strangers. Yet you sat at that table completely unfazed, and you handed my father a corporate tax loophole that senior attorneys charging thousands of dollars an hour couldn't come up with. This entire narrative your family sold me is full of holes. It doesn't make any sense. I studied her carefully. I could see the real struggle in her eyes. Chloe was a good person. She came from a family that valued education, integrity, and hard work. She had built her own success, and she had naturally assumed Julian shared those same core values. She was slowly realizing that she was about to legally tie herself to a family of career con artists. So, what exactly are you asking me, Chloe? I asked, my tone gentle but firm. She looked me dead in the eye. I'm asking you who you really are. Because if Julian can lie this easily, this seamlessly about his own sister's entire existence, I need to know what else he's hiding before I sign a marriage certificate. I was just about to answer her when the heavy oak door of the lounge swung open. The ambient noise in the room seemed to drop instantly. Marcus walked in. Chloe's father was wearing a sharp, custom navy suit and carrying a designer briefcase, his stride carrying the unyielding authority of a federal judge. His sharp gaze scanned the room, locked onto our secluded booth, and he walked straight toward us. Chloe blinked in shock as her father approached the table. "Dad?" She half stood up. "What are you doing here?" Marcus gestured for her to sit with an elegant wave of his hand. He slid into the booth right next to me, signaled the waiter for an espresso, and turned his piercing eyes toward his daughter. "I'm here, Chloe, because it's time for you to understand exactly what kind of family you are marrying into," Marcus said, his voice smooth but laced with iron. "More importantly, it's time you realize who you've been ignoring." Chloe looked back and forth between her father and me, her confusion deepening. "You two know each other?" Marcus let out a cool, calculated smile. He gestured toward me with open respect. "Chloe, let me officially introduce you to Elena. She isn't a low-level repair tech. She is the founder and CEO of Aegis Quantum Solutions. She is an industry titan in federal cybersecurity and data infrastructure." Chloe froze. The air was sucked right out of her lungs. Marcus didn't stop there. In fact, just last week, my firm signed a $100 million data fortress agreement with her company. The assets Elena controls are beyond anything Julian or your future in-laws could even begin to imagine. She is a self-made powerhouse, while your fiancé has been parading her around as the family failure just to soothe his own pathetic ego. Chloe's jaw practically dropped. She stared at me, then back at her father, as the heavy reality of my true identity hit her like a tidal wave. The woman her fiancé had looked down on, the sister he had ordered to pull internet cables, was actually a corporate giant sitting on the same level as the most powerful executives in the city. "Julian told me you dropped out of college," Chloe stammered, her auditor's brain desperately trying to process the sheer scale of the lie. "He said you were drowning in debt." I gave a faint smile, my eyes turning hard as flint. "Julian is incredibly gifted at projecting his own insecurities," I replied. "I didn't drop out. Our parents drained my college trust fund to pay off Julian's endless DUI settlements and failed investments. They left me out on the street, and I built an empire out of the mud they threw me in." Chloe leaned heavily back against the leather booth, looking physically ill. The sickening implications of Julian lying so effortlessly about his own sister's entire existence were terrifying. Marcus reached across the table, placing a steadying hand on his daughter's arm. "I saw how that family treated her at the restaurant," Marcus said quietly. "And I saw how Julian was eyeing your bank accounts. You're a smart woman, Chloe. It's time to wake up and see the trap you're walking into." Chloe looked at me, a fierce fire of betrayal burning in her chest. "What else is he hiding, Elena?" she demanded, her voice raw with anger. I picked up my coffee cup, taking a slow, deliberate sip. "I think, Chloe, it's time to run a full financial background check on your groom-to-be, because you are definitely not going to like what you find." I sat there quietly, the smooth leather of the booth creaking slightly as Chloe pressed her weight against the table. My words hung in the air, heavy and sharp as a knife. I had just told her to perform financial due diligence on her future husband, and the absolute certainty in my voice left no room for doubt. She looked toward her father. Marcus simply took a slow sip of his espresso and gave a firm, confirming nod. The illusion Chloe had been living in shattered completely. She was an incredibly sharp senior auditor whose entire career was built on identifying fraud, analyzing risk, and protecting clients from bad investments. Yet she had allowed a man with a charming smile and a hollow core to blind her to the massive red flags waving right in front of her. The humiliation of that realization washed over her, hardening her features into a mask of pure professional calculation. "I still can't wrap my head around the scale of it," Chloe whispered, her voice tight. "Julian told me you lived in government-subsidized housing. He told me you handled toxic electronic waste because you had zero market value. He spun this entire tragic story about how it broke his heart to see his sister fail so miserably." Marcus set his coffee cup down on the saucer with a sharp clink. "He spun that story to elevate himself, Chloe. It's a classic diversion tactic. If everyone is looking at the supposed failure in the room, nobody looks at the actual con artist." Elena doesn't run internet cables. She buys towers, rebuilds data centers, and controls the digital lifeblood of this city. Marcus leaned forward, using the authoritative tone that made him a senior partner. You need to understand the weight of the woman sitting across from you. When my firm put out a public tender to manage our core confidential network, we received proposals from the largest global companies in the country. Elena completely dismantled her competition. The infrastructure strategy Aegis Quantum put forward saved us 20% in projected operational costs. We didn't give her a 9-figure contract out of charity. We gave it to her because she is a ruthless, brilliant operator. Chloe stared at me, the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. She took in the flawless tailoring of my charcoal suit, my composed posture, and the absolute stillness I maintained in the face of her father's overwhelming presence. It all made sense with a terrifying clarity. "And yet, you just sat there at the restaurant," Chloe murmured, rubbing her chin. "You sat there and listened to your father tell me they had given up on you. You let them toss a $5,000 bill at you like you were the hired help. Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you expose them right then and there?" "Because premature execution is sloppy," I answered, my voice cool and measured. If I had thrown my net worth in their faces at that table, they would have instantly played the victims. My mother would have cried. My father would have accused me of hoarding wealth while ignoring family struggles. Julian would have twisted the narrative to make me look like a cruel, arrogant tyrant. I spent 15 years building my empire in the shadows, Chloe. I didn't survive their abuse just to have a petty outburst over a steak dinner. When I dismantle their facade, I will do it so thoroughly that they will never recover. Chloe leaned back, a deep sense of respect replacing her earlier confusion. The bride-to-be who was blinded by love was entirely gone now. The sharp, predatory senior M&A auditor had fully awakened. "Everything is starting to track," Chloe said, her eyes narrowing as she analyzed recent events. They kept pushing for a lavish wedding, desperate to book the most expensive venues and catering. Julian insisted we merge our finances early, claiming it would streamline the wedding payments. He said his venture fund had massive capital tied up in offshore liquidity pools. Just last week, he asked me to wire $30,000 to a vendor because he claimed his corporate account was undergoing a routine SEC audit. Marcus let out a sharp, humorless chuckle. "An audit? That is the oldest lie in the fraud playbook. I told you, Chloe, I've survived 30 years in corporate law because I can smell bad debt from a mile away. Julian is a walking toxic asset. His parents are co-conspirators. They saw your wealth, your status, and our family name, and they locked onto you like wolves." Chloe gritted her teeth. She looked sick to her stomach, but beneath the nausea was a cold, simmering rage. She had been played, and a woman of her intellect was not about to tolerate being used as a financial stepping stone. She opened her briefcase, pulled out a legal notepad, and clicked her expensive pen. "I owe you a massive apology, Elena," Chloe said, her pen hovering over the paper. "I sat at that table and watched them treat you like garbage." "You didn't know the rules of the game we were playing," I responded smoothly. "But you do now. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Chloe looked up, her dark eyes reflecting a lethal determination. "I'm going to do exactly what you suggested. I'm going to use every tool at my disposal to rip his financial history wide open. I'm pulling every tax record, every credit report, and every LLC registration tied to his name. I'm tracking every single dollar he claims to have put into that imaginary venture fund." She wrote Julian's full legal name on the pad, underlining it twice with aggressive force. "If he's hiding debt, I'll find it," Chloe promised, her voice entirely devoid of warmth. "If he's using my money to cover his personal failures, I'll document every single wire transfer. I'm building an airtight fraud case against my own fiancé." Marcus smiled approvingly, picking up his leather briefcase. "That's my girl." "Gather your evidence, Chloe," I said, "but do not spook him. Do not change your behavior. Let him think he's still completely in control. We only strike when we have absolute leverage." Marcus turned his sharp gaze toward me, his expression carrying a deep mutual respect. "It is an absolute privilege doing business with you, Elena. I have a feeling the next few weeks are going to be spectacular." "The feeling is mutual, Marcus," I replied with a slight nod. Chloe stood up, sliding the notepad back into her briefcase. She gave me one last look, the alliance between us firmly cemented. "I'll call you the second I have the forensic audit report ready," Chloe said. "Thank you for waking me up, Elena." I watched her walk out of the private lounge, her back rigid with righteous fury. The trap was officially set. My brother thought he had secured a golden ticket to a life of endless luxury. He thought he could use his wealthy wife to fund his delusions while keeping his brilliant, wildly successful sister locked in the basement of the family narrative. He was about to discover that the woman he was trying to scam had just joined forces with the sister he loved to humiliate. I gestured to the waiter for the tab, dropped a crisp $100 bill on the marble tabletop, and stepped out into the bustling Dallas morning. The empire was finally stepping out of the shadows, and my family was completely defenseless against the storm headed their way. Chloe walked into the towering glass skyscraper of her Big Four firm, her mind operating with the lethal precision of a guided missile. She gave her assistant a curt nod, walked straight into her corner office, and locked the heavy oak door behind her. She threw her briefcase on the desk, shed her blazer, and rolled up her sleeves. The loving, supportive fiancé was gone. Sitting behind that desk was a ruthless auditor preparing to dissect a hostile entity. She booted up her dual monitors, bypassing standard public search engines, and logged directly into the firm's highly restricted executive database used for deep corporate due diligence and risk assessment. She typed Julian's full legal name, date of birth, and current address into the search bar. She hit the enter key and leaned back in her chair, watching the digital veil that masked the man she was about to marry crash to the ground. The results popped up instantly, flashing across her dual monitors like a relentless storm of red flags. Chloe started with his business footprint. For the past 2 years, Julian had been bragging non-stop about his decentralized crypto fund, claiming its operations were expanding across the country. Chloe pulled up the Texas Secretary of State Corporate Registry to search for his LLC. The status of the company flashed across the screen in glaring red capital letters: forfeited. Digging deeper, she pulled up the public court dockets associated with the business name. Julian wasn't running a successful fund at all. Exactly 12 months ago, he had been legally evicted from his high-end commercial office space for non-payment of rent. A default judgment had been entered against him, ordering him to pay $40,000 in back rent and damages. The state had also slapped a tax lien on the business for failure to pay franchise taxes. The entity he had just spent 20 minutes bragging about to her father, claiming it would deliver massive returns to investors by Q3, had been legally dead for a solid year. A cold, heavy knot formed in Chloe's stomach. But she didn't stop there. She switched tabs, moving from his corporate failure to his personal financial trajectory. Using her firm's high-level access to credit screening portals, she ran a soft inquiry on his personal credit history. The debt profile was staggering. This wasn't just poor financial management. This was a catastrophic train wreck where vanity and delusion collided at 100 miles an hour. Julian was drowning in $314,000 of unsecured high-interest debt. Chloe gritted her teeth as she scrolled through the itemized list of accounts. There were 3 maxed-out platinum credit cards. There were multiple toxic personal loans from predatory subprime lenders. He was currently being hounded by debt collection agencies for outstanding balances at luxury medical spas, high-end sports car leasing agencies, and exclusive country clubs. He had been funding his entire millionaire lifestyle on high-interest debt, using borrowed money to buy designer clothes, pay for expensive dinners, and maintain the illusion of success. The reality hit Chloe like a freight train. She wasn't his partner. She was his financial bailout package. She picked up her encrypted phone and opened her personal banking app, her fingers moving mechanically. She navigated to the joint checking account she had recently opened with Julian to manage wedding expenses. She reviewed the transaction history for the past 45 days. Last week, Julian had asked her to deposit $30,000, claiming he needed to pay a deposit for a premier overseas holographic projection team whose corporate account was supposedly being audited. Chloe traced the routing number of that outgoing wire transfer. The money hadn't gone to any overseas planning team. It had been wired directly to a high-risk debt collection agency in Delaware to clear one of his defaulted personal loans. She kept scrolling down. $15,000, money that was supposed to be reserved for custom invitations and the catering deposit, had been wired directly into a joint checking account under the names of Arthur and Eleanor. Julian was actively draining her wealth to pay off his hidden debts and fund his parents' fake luxury lifestyle. The entire family was completely broke, and they were using her hard-earned money to keep their heads above water. Chloe stared at the monitors, a fierce, burning rage of betrayal tightening in her chest. She came from a proud family of self-made legal and financial professionals who had earned every single dime and ounce of status they possessed. Her father had broken through elite barriers in the legal world. She worked 80-hour weeks to become a senior auditor at her firm. And this family of arrogant, superficial con artists actually believed they could use her as a private ATM while treating their brilliant, entirely self-made future sister-in-law like basement trash. She picked up her phone and dialed my private number. On the other side of the city, in my sprawling executive office, I picked up after 2 rings. "That supposed hedge fund went bankrupt a year ago," Chloe said, her voice sounding like a low, dangerous rumble of thunder. "He is over $300,000 in the red. He is draining the wedding funds to pay off loan sharks and funneling cash directly to your parents." I leaned back in my leather swivel chair, gazing out at the Dallas skyline. "You verified the wire transfers?" "Every single one," Chloe confirmed, any remaining warmth completely gone from her tone. "My father was right. You were right. This marriage is nothing but a financial rescue operation. They found a sucker with a massive bank account and a good family name, and they locked their teeth into me." "What is your next move, Chloe?" I asked calmly. I could hear the sharp clack of her laptop closing over the line. "If I call off the wedding right now," she replied, "he will play the victim. He'll run to his social circle crying about how I got cold feet, and your parents will sweep their crimes under the rug and move on to find their next target. I'm not letting them walk away with their dignity intact. I want them to put on their expensive suits. I want them to invite every single high society contact they have. And then, I am going to pull the lever on the guillotine myself. In front of everyone." I smiled, a deep sense of respect washing over me. "Then we stick to the plan. Keep playing the devoted fiancé. I'll keep playing the invisible blue-collar worker. Let them get comfortable. Let them feel invincible." "I'll see you on the battlefield, Elena," Chloe said, her voice hard as iron. She hung up the phone. That evening, Chloe walked into the luxury high-rise apartment she shared with Julian. Julian was sitting on the velvet sofa, sipping imported wine, and scrolling through bridesmaid dress fabric samples on a tablet. He looked up and flashed her a brilliant smile, playing the role of the loving, innocent fiancé flawlessly. "How was your day at the firm, babe?" Julian asked, setting down his glass and walking over to wrap his arms around her neck. Chloe looked down at the man who was stealing her money, lying about his entire existence, and conspiring with his parents to treat his own sister like a servant. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. Instead, she wrapped her arms around his waist and gave him a warm, perfect smile. "It was incredibly productive," Chloe replied smoothly, planting a soft kiss on his forehead. "I finalized some very important audit contracts today. I promise you, Julian, our wedding is going to be something your family will never forget." The morning after Chloe vowed to dismantle Julian's facade, I was sitting at the head of the Obsidian conference table at Aegis Quantum Solutions. We were finalizing the operational transition of our newly acquired assets, specifically focusing on the data security and physical protection protocols for the Apex Tower. The room was filled with the quiet, efficient hum of top-tier executives perfectly executing a corporate strategy. My mind was hyper-focused on profit margins and structural evaluations displayed on the massive digital screens. The heavy glass door of the conference room slid open, breaking the quiet focus. Vance, my chief of security, strode into the room, bypassing the usual reporting protocols entirely. He didn't wait for a break in the presentation. He walked straight to my chair, his face tight and his knuckles white as he gripped an encrypted security tablet. "We have a severe internal security breach," Vance whispered, leaning down to ensure his voice didn't travel down the long table. "I need you in your office immediately." I didn't ask questions. I gave a polite nod of dismissal to the board members and followed Vance down the heavily carpeted hallway into my private corner suite. The moment the heavy oak door shut, Vance handed me the tablet, his expression a mix of professional fury and deep personal concern. "The high-priority alert you requested on your personal financial files triggered a retroactive scan of your credit history," Vance explained, pacing in front of my desk. "The system flagged a catastrophic anomaly. A massive delinquency hit the credit bureaus first thing this morning." I looked down at the glowing screen. A $150,000 unsecured bridge loan had just gone into default. It was tied directly to my social security number. I stared at the financial breakdown, my eyes tracing the staggering punitive interest rates and late fees. I hadn't applied for a personal loan in over a decade. Every single asset I owned was safely shielded behind corporate holding companies or airtight blind trusts. My personal credit profile was completely isolated from my commercial empire. "Pull the original filing documents," I commanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy calm. Find out exactly where this loan originated and who authorized the disbursement. Vance tapped furiously on the screen, bypassing encrypted firewalls to pull the raw digital paperwork from the lending institution. It was a high-risk predatory loan, opened 6 months ago, long before I had my security team lock down my files. I studied the digital signatures on the loan agreement. It was a carefully rehearsed, perfect forgery of my handwriting. But amateur criminals always leave digital footprints, and the people who committed this fraud were stunningly arrogant. Vance pointed to the IP address where the loan was initiated and the bank routing number where the $150,000 had been deposited. The IP address tracked precisely to a residential property in the suburbs of Dallas, specifically my parents' house. The routing number belonged to a joint checking account under the names of Arthur and Eleanor. All the pieces clicked together with a sickening, undeniable clarity. My parents had kept my social security number from the days I lived under their roof as a teenager. When they realized they couldn't actually afford the lavish high society wedding they had promised Julian, they didn't rein in their vanity. Instead, they committed federal-level identity theft. They took out a $150,000 loan in my name to fund the expensive venue rental, the dress from Paris, and the elite vendor deposits that required upfront payment before Chloe stepped in to cover the remaining balances. The sheer breathless audacity of it washed over me like ice water. They thought I was just some struggling blue-collar cable puller stuck in a basement. They assumed a low-level repair tech would never bother running a comprehensive credit check or monitoring her own financial footprint. And if I did happen to stumble across that defaulted loan years down the road, they figured I'd be too poor and uneducated to hire a federal-level litigator to fight the debt. They were perfectly willing to let my entire financial future burn to the ground, trapping me in an inescapable mountain of debt, just so their golden boy could play a fake billionaire for a single afternoon. They sat right across from me in that exclusive private club, mocking my supposed poverty and forcing me to foot their $5,200 bill, while knowing full well they had already stolen $150,000 in my name. This was no longer a case of a toxic, dysfunctional family dynamic. This wasn't just emotional manipulation or narcissistic vanity. They had crossed a massive line into federal felony territory. I felt a cold, absolute stillness wash over my entire body. 15 years of accumulated anger evaporated into thin air, replaced by the chilling, methodical focus of an executioner. "Should I call the FBI?" Vance asked, pulling his phone from his tactical pocket. "I can have our legal department draft a formal fraud affidavit. The feds will be knocking on their door before lunch. Identity theft of this magnitude carries severe mandatory minimums." "No," I said quietly, sliding the security tablet back across the desk. "Do not contest the debt with the lenders yet. Do not flag the accounts. If we report the fraud now, the bank will freeze their assets and tip off an investigation. They'll panic, they'll hire defense attorneys, and they'll try to negotiate a quiet plea deal out of the spotlight. I don't want them panicking in private. I want them to think they got away with it." Vance stared at me, a slow grin of realization spreading across his face. "You want to maximize the casualties." I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the sprawling Dallas skyline. "I'm going to let them put on their most expensive suits," I replied, my voice smooth and lethal. "I'm going to let them invite every single high society contact they have desperately tried to impress. I'm going to let them stand inside a $100 million tower that I own. And then I am going to pull the floor right out from under their feet in front of everybody." I pulled my encrypted work phone from my jacket pocket and opened a new secure messaging thread with Chloe. I attached the raw digital files, the forged signatures, and the network address mapped precisely to my parents' living room. I sent one simple, direct text to the woman who was currently building her own arsenal against my younger brother. "They didn't just lie to you, Chloe. They committed a federal felony. The stage is set." I hit send and watched the delivery confirmation flash on the screen. The response took less than 30 seconds. Chloe didn't call to ask for details. She just texted back 2 words: "Burn them." I locked my phone, walked out of my corner office, and headed straight into the executive war room located in the secure core of the Aegis Quantum headquarters. The war room was a windowless, completely soundproofed command center designed for hostile takeovers, corporate espionage defense, and crisis management. It was equipped with military-grade encrypted servers and digital displays covering entire walls. Today, it was going to serve as the staging ground for my family's absolute destruction. I called Vance inside and instructed him to bring in our chief corporate litigator, Garrett. I told them both to drop whatever multi-million-dollar merger paperwork they were currently reviewing. We had a domestic fraud case that required absolute and immediate attention. The heavy reinforced doors locked automatically behind Vance and Garrett as they stepped into the room. Standing at the head of the long glass table, I projected the $150,000 fraudulent loan document onto the main wall display. I didn't shed a single tear. I didn't ask for sympathy, and I didn't offer any emotional backstory. I operated with the cold detachment of a surgeon preparing to excise a terminal tumor. My parents stole my social security number to finance a wedding, I stated, my voice echoing coldly in the hollow room. They committed federal identity theft. I want every single digital fingerprint they left behind fully excavated and documented within the hour. Garrett, a lethal, razor-sharp litigator who had dismantled entire hostile corporations for me, didn't even blink. He opened his laptop, immediately deploying our dedicated team of cybersecurity analysts. The predatory lending institution had authorized the initial signature online. Our team utilized legitimate back-end utility software to pull the precise digital footprint of the loan's origination. In less than 20 minutes, the data populated on the main screen. Our analysts traced the source IP address straight to the registered router inside my parents' suburban home. They went a step further, locking down the specific MAC address of the hardware used. It was Arthur's desktop computer. The exact machine my father used to manage his superficial country club memberships and complain about property taxes had been used to commit a federal felony against his own daughter. Next, I turned our focus to the forged electronic signatures and scanned hard copy documents submitted to the bank. Garrett patched a forensic handwriting expert into the war room via a secure video link. We pulled public records of my mother's signature from various charity board applications and country club registries. Within minutes, the expert confirmed that the loops and pressure points on the fraudulent loan application perfectly matched Eleanor's distinct, overly ornate handwriting style. She hadn't even bothered to properly disguise her penmanship. She was so blinded by her own arrogance, so utterly certain that I was a helpless, uneducated cable tech, that she assumed nobody would ever investigate the paperwork. But we needed the final nail in the coffin. For the spectacle I was planning, digital tracking wouldn't be enough. The terms of the loan had required secondary identification documents to be physically notarized at a local branch of the lending institution. Utilizing Garrett's massive legal leverage and an expedited preservation of evidence order, we subpoenaed the high-definition security footage from the bank lobby on the exact day and time the loan was finalized. I stood with my arms crossed, watching the crystal-clear video play out on the war room display. There they were. Arthur and Eleanor walked into the bank in their usual well-tailored country club attire, looking completely relaxed and unfazed. Eleanor handed a manila folder full of documents to the loan officer. As she laid the paperwork out on the desk, the high-resolution camera caught the contents perfectly. My old, faded physical social security card, the one she had kept locked away in her home safe for 15 years, was sitting right there on the counter. I watched my parents flash warm smiles, shake hands with the branch manager, and stroll out of the glass doors. They had successfully stolen $150,000 to fund Julian's fake billionaire wedding. Watching my own flesh and blood joyfully destroy my financial identity didn't break my heart. It simply tempered my resolve into an unbreakable diamond. They felt absolutely zero remorse. They viewed my entire existence as something to be discarded and consumed for their own benefit. Garrett compiled the network logs, the forensic handwriting analysis, the banking transactions, and the high-definition security footage into a devastating legal dossier. He placed the heavy leather binder on the glass table in front of me. "If we turn this over to the district attorney right now," Garrett advised, his tone strictly business, "Arthur and Eleanor will be in handcuffs before sundown. The evidence is airtight. They are looking at serious mandatory minimums for identity theft and wire fraud." I placed my hand flat on the leather binder. "I'm not giving this to the police today, Garrett. If they are arrested quietly at home, they'll hire defense lawyers, cut a plea deal in the dark, and lie to their high society friends that it was all just a big misunderstanding. They'll spin a story where they are the victims. I am not giving them that luxury." Vance looked at me, a cold smile touching his lips. "You want a public execution?" "I want them to lose everything in front of the exact people they committed this crime to impress," I corrected smoothly. "Lock the binder in the corporate vault until I give the signal." I left the war room and walked back to my office, the adrenaline of the hunt coursing through my veins. The arsenal was fully assembled, the evidence was bulletproof. I pulled out my encrypted phone and initiated a three-way secure call with Chloe and her father, Marcus. The intelligence gathering phase was over. It was time to coordinate our final strike, laying a flawless trap that would ensure my family wouldn't realize they were dead until the ground completely vanished beneath them. An hour after that phone call, the three of us sat inside the private, soundproofed study of my downtown Dallas penthouse. The heavy mahogany doors were locked tight, and the brilliant lights of the city skyline flickered faintly through the ballistic glass. Chloe was pacing across the Persian rug like a caged panther. For the past hour, she had been reviewing the digital forensic reports I had sent over the secure line. The cold, calculated senior auditor was currently fighting a brutal battle with pure, unfiltered rage. Marcus, on the other hand, sat with absolute composure on a tufted velvet sofa, slowly swirling a glass of neat bourbon, though a lethal protectiveness burned in his deep-set eyes. "This is completely psychopathic." Chloe turned to face me, her voice dropping into a sharp, trembling register. "My fiancé is a pathological fraud with over $300,000 of toxic debt, and your parents just committed a federal felony to cover the venue deposit. I am calling my firm right now. I'm canceling all the vendor contracts. I am blast emailing my entire guest list to announce that the wedding is permanently called off due to criminal fraud. And then I'm calling the Texas Rangers to drag Arthur and Eleanor out of their beds." She aggressively reached for her phone, her thumb hovering over her contacts. I stood up from my leather armchair, walked directly over to her, and blocked her path. "Don't make that call, Chloe," I said, keeping my voice completely steady. She stared at me, her jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitching in her cheek. "Elena, they used your social security number to steal $150,000. They are actively draining my checking account. There is absolutely no way I am standing at an altar with a man who views me as a cash machine. This ends tonight." "If you call off the wedding in private tonight, they win," I explained patiently, meeting her furious gaze without flinching. Chloe frowned, lowering her phone slightly. "How do they win if they go to federal prison?" "Because if you blow this up in private, they won't go to prison at all," I replied, outlining the harsh judicial reality of the upper class. "If you cancel the wedding via a blast email, Julian will immediately launch a massive public relations war on social media, painting himself as the heartbroken, jilted groom. Arthur and Eleanor will play the fiercely protective, devastated parents. They'll hire aggressive defense attorneys, claim the loan was just a misunderstanding or a clerical error, and use their country club connections to get the district attorney to offer a harmless plea deal. They will maintain their fake luxury mask, and you will be painted as the cold, arrogant businesswoman who couldn't handle commitment." Marcus took a slow sip of his bourbon, nodding in absolute agreement. "Elena is exactly right, Chloe. In the world of high finance and high society, appearances are everything. If you kill this wedding quietly, they control the narrative. They will brand you a coward who got cold feet, and Elena will be the bitter older sister who poisoned your mind with forged documents out of pure jealousy." Chloe looked at me, then back at her father. The initial explosive fury was slowly giving way to cold, calculated legal logic. "So what do we do?" she asked, her voice leveling out into a dangerous hum. "We give them exactly what they want." A dark smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. "We give them the most lavish, expensive, high-profile wedding reception this city has seen all year. We let them invite every single power player they have desperately tried to impress. We let them stand in the grand ballroom of the Apex Tower, drinking vintage champagne. We let them build a pedestal that reaches the clouds, and then we let the inevitable fall smash them into absolute dust." Chloe crossed her arms, leaning back against the mahogany bookshelf. She was tracking my strategic thinking perfectly. "What about the marriage license? I'm not legally binding myself to a fraud. You simply forget to bring your passport and birth certificate the morning of the ceremony," Marcus suggested calmly, displaying the ruthless pragmatism of a former federal judge. "Tell the officiant that because the county clerk missed a signature, you'll sign the legal paperwork Monday morning. The ceremony will be pure theater, zero legal validity." "We let them go all the way to the toasts at the reception," I continued, sketching out the final architecture of the trap. "We let Julian give his grand speech. We let him thank his parents for their generosity and wealth. And then, Chloe, you take the microphone. You present your financial audit to the entire room, and I will step out of the shadows to present mine. Chloe took a deep, breathy sigh of disbelief, finally grasping the terrifying scale of the psychological warfare we were deploying. She looked at the forensic documents scattered across the coffee table, then turned her eyes back to me. They will be trapped in a room filled with 300 of the most influential people in Dallas, including my entire family and corporate partners, and they will have absolutely nowhere to run. Exactly, I said. We lock the doors in a metaphorical sense, hand them the match, and let them light their own funeral pyre. They want to play billionaires on my blood and bones. I'll make sure their final performance is historic. Marcus raised his glass of bourbon, a predatory gleam of approval in his eyes. To the greatest wedding of the year, he toasted, his voice smooth and terrifyingly cold. Chloe picked up a crystal tumbler from the side table, all hesitation completely gone from her posture. She clinked her glass against her father's, then turned her dark, resolute eyes to me. To the greatest wedding of the year, she echoed. I didn't hold a glass, but I smiled, knowing the board was set perfectly. My family would joyfully march down the aisle, straight into a financial and legal slaughterhouse, completely oblivious to the executioner waiting for them at the end of the altar. On the evening before the wedding, a heavy downpour washed the streets of Dallas clean. I stood in the kitchen of my penthouse, pouring a glass of sparkling water, enjoying the absolute serenity that comes with a perfectly laid trap. The legal files were safely locked in my corporate vault. The security team at the Apex Tower had been briefed and was ready. Tomorrow would be a masterpiece of perfectly controlled demolition. The sharp chime of the private elevator broke the silence. I glanced at the security monitor embedded in the marble wall. Eleanor was standing in the lobby downstairs, aggressively stabbing the intercom button with her manicured finger. I authorized her entry, purely curious to see how far she could push her audacity on the eve of her final performance. A minute later, the heavy metal doors of the private elevator slid open directly into my foyer. Eleanor strode in, shaking rain off her expensive trench coat. She didn't bother with a greeting. Her eyes swept over the massive, multi-million-dollar penthouse, taking in the panoramic views of the city skyline, the custom-imported Italian furniture, and the soaring vaulted ceilings. But instead of recognizing the immense wealth required to inhabit a property like this, her brain immediately constructed a narrative that fit her delusions. "You are incredibly lucky to have found a house-sitting gig this high-end," Eleanor said, her voice echoing through the vast space as she kicked off her damp shoes. "Or the real owner must be desperate to need a low-level worker around just to keep the dust off the furniture. You better make sure you don't scratch anything, Elena. You could never afford to replace this furniture on your pathetic computer repair salary." I leaned against the kitchen island, taking a slow sip of my water. "It is a very stable arrangement, Mother. I assure you the real owner is extremely satisfied with how I manage the property." Eleanor waved her hand dismissively, having zero interest in my living situation. She marched over to the island, slamming a crumpled plastic shopping bag onto the spotless quartz countertop. She looked manic. The stress of financing a fraudulent wedding was clearly taking a toll on her face beneath the thick layers of foundation. "I don't have time for your small talk," Eleanor snapped, rummaging through the plastic bag. "Tomorrow is the most important day of Julian's life. Chloe's family has brought in highly influential guests from all over the country. Corporate executives, federal judges, financial tycoons. There is zero room for error, and I will not allow you to ruin our reputation." She yanked a bundle of fabric from the bag and threw it directly at my chest. I caught it before it hit the floor. It was a cheap, stiff black polyester uniform, a pair of incredibly unflattering, shapeless cargo pants, and a black polo shirt with a poorly screen-printed logo, complete with a generic IT support name tag clipped to the collar. It smelled faintly of industrial warehouse chemicals. "I want you in this the second you step foot onto the Apex Tower property tomorrow," Eleanor barked in a harsh, dictatorial tone. "You are to use the freight elevator at the back of the building exclusively. You are not to interact with any of the catering or planning staff, and you are strictly forbidden from crossing the main lobby." I looked down at the scratchy polyester fabric in my hands. This was the visual representation of my existence in my mother's eyes. "You want me to wear a costume?" My voice was flat, completely devoid of emotion. "It's not a costume, it's your uniform," Eleanor corrected viciously. "I know you promised Julian you'd bring your little workers to get the building's network smoothed out for free. I want all the data cables in the grand ballroom perfectly hidden before the florists arrive at noon. But once the guests start arriving for the ceremony, you disappear. You stay in the server rooms or the service corridors. Do not let Chloe's family see you. Do not speak to anyone. You are there to work, Elena. You are not a guest. Do you understand me?" I stared at the woman standing in front of me. She had stolen my college fund, stolen my social security number, and actively planned to destroy my financial future just to buy a ticket into high society. And right now, she was standing in my penthouse, in a building owned by my company, yelling at me like a stray dog she had graciously allowed into the backyard. If I were still the broken 20-year-old girl she threw out 15 years ago, this moment would have destroyed me. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I was a predator watching a target that had willingly walked into a cage and locked the door from the inside. "Are you listening to me?" Eleanor slammed her hand on the quartz countertop, infuriated by my lack of immediate reaction. "This isn't a request. If you embarrass your brother tomorrow, if you try to mingle with people 10 tiers above your social station and make a joke out of us, I swear I will make you regret it for the rest of your life." I slowly folded the cheap black polo shirt, deliberately smoothing out the creases. I looked up at Eleanor, a calm, eerie smile spreading across my face. It was a smile entirely devoid of warmth, filled with the quiet, lethal certainty of a judge passing a final sentence. "Don't worry, Mother," I said, my voice smooth as silk. "I will follow your instructions perfectly. I will make sure everything is hidden, and I will stay completely out of sight until the exact moment I am needed." Eleanor froze for a fraction of a second. She had expected an argument. She expected me to cry or beg for a seat at the reception or complain about how harsh her rules were. My absolute indifference and compliance unnerved her, but her massive ego quickly brushed the instinct away. She convinced herself that I was simply accepting my submissive place at the bottom of her grand hierarchy. "You don't need to worry about a thing, Mother," I said, my voice smooth, melodic, and terrifyingly cold. "I know exactly what my job is. I'll make sure the grand ballroom is absolutely flawless. I will personally take care of all the trash." Eleanor let out a massive sigh of relief, smoothing down her expensive trench coat. "Good. See that you do. Julian needs everything to be absolutely perfect tomorrow. Don't be late." She turned on her heel and strode back toward the private elevator, clearly eager to escape the presence of her disappointing daughter. As the metal doors slid open to receive her, she cast one final contemptuous glance over her shoulder. "Just remember your place, Elena." The elevator doors slid shut, sealing her fate. I stood alone in the quiet kitchen, the cheap, scratchy polyester uniform still clutched in my hands. I walked over to the stainless steel trash can, stepped on the pedal, and dropped the black uniform straight into the garbage. "Don't worry, Mother," I whispered to the empty room. "I promise you, tomorrow is going to be a clean sweep." I walked down the hallway into my master suite and opened my sprawling walk-in closet. Hanging right in the center of the illuminated display area was a flawlessly pressed, bespoke midnight blue Tom Ford haute couture suit. It was a $12,000 masterpiece of modern tailoring, paired with a crisp silk shirt and genuine diamond cufflinks. It was the exact antithesis of a repair tech's uniform. It was the armor of a conqueror. I turned off the closet lights and went to bed, sleeping better than I had in weeks. Tomorrow the sun would rise over the Apex Tower, and before it set, my family's entire world would burn to the ground. Early morning sunlight hit the sleek glass exterior of the Apex Tower in downtown Austin, reflecting a blinding brilliance across the city. This glass dome monument of unyielding wealth and cutting-edge technology was currently playing host to my parents, who strutted through the doors as if they had personally laid every single floor panel themselves. Arthur and Eleanor arrived 3 hours before the ceremony was even scheduled to begin. They immediately started treating the historic multi-million-dollar landmark like it was their personal kingdom. Eleanor, wearing an incredibly expensive custom champagne-colored gown, paraded across the vast main lobby, her heels echoing sharply against the imported Italian marble. She ran a critical finger over a gold leaf console table, complaining loudly about non-existent dust to ensure the nearby event coordinators heard her dissatisfaction. Julian made his grand entrance shortly after, gliding down the streamlined glass staircase. He wore a top-tier custom tuxedo funded entirely by the fraudulent loan he had stolen using my identity, radiating a smug, self-satisfied aura. He carried himself like a monarch inspecting his subjects, demanding absolute obedience from anyone within his line of sight. They descended on the venue's service staff like a swarm of locusts. A young waiter carrying a silver tray of crystal champagne flutes hurried past, shifting slightly off the designated path to avoid a massive floral installation. Arthur snapped his fingers at the young man, a sharp, demeaning sound that shattered the elegant ambiance of the room. "Watch where you're walking, kid," Arthur barked, adjusting the cuffs of his rented tuxedo. "We paid an astronomical fortune for this venue, and I will not tolerate clumsy, low-end labor ruining the aesthetic. Go find your manager immediately and tell him I want you sent back to the kitchen where you belong." The young waiter's face flushed bright red as he quickly hurried away. Standing entirely motionless near the main entrance was Garrett, the head of the private security team. Built like a brick wall with broad shoulders, Garrett was a former private military contractor who had handled high-risk operations overseas. He had been personally selected by my executive team to oversee all high-value assets under the Aegis Quantum umbrella. He knew every single square inch of this tower's infrastructure. More importantly, he knew exactly whose signature was on his paychecks. When Arthur yelled at the waiter, Garrett didn't intervene. He simply exchanged a microscopic, ironic smirk with another security officer stationed near the glass staircase. They were seasoned professionals, but watching a crowd of arrogant strangers bark orders at staff they didn't employ, inside a building they didn't own, all to impress a family they could never compete with. It was top-tier morning entertainment. Chloe's father, Marcus, arrived a short while later. He led a distinguished delegation of relatives made up of federal judges, senior M&A partners, and banking titans. They exuded a true sense of class and generational achievement. They had no need to project wealth. They simply embodied it. Eleanor locked onto them instantly, like a vulture spotting fresh prey. She forced an outrageously bright fake smile, opened her arms, and rushed across the marble floor. "Marcus, darling, welcome to our little celebration," Eleanor announced loudly, making sure her voice echoed off the dome. "I truly hope the drive down from Dallas wasn't too exhausting for your family. We fell in love with the Apex Tower the moment we saw it. We told Julian that no expense should be spared for the most special day of his life. We demanded nothing less than the absolute best venue in the entire state." Marcus accepted her greeting with cold, unassailable grace. His sharp eyes scanned the breathtaking architecture, taking in the costly suspended internal structures and the holographic projection dome. He knew precisely who owned this building, and it definitely wasn't the woman bragging in front of him. "It is indeed a breathtaking piece of real estate, Eleanor," Marcus replied, his tone perfectly level. "The sheer depth of capital and elite corporate management required to maintain an establishment of this caliber is staggering. One has to admire the brilliant mind pulling the strings behind the scenes." Eleanor beamed, completely missing the lethal irony woven into Marcus's words. She assumed he was complimenting her exquisite taste in venues. "Well, it takes a certain pedigree to appreciate this level of value," Eleanor boasted, waving a hand toward the towering crystal chandeliers. "Arthur and I have always prioritized high society elegance. We wanted to make sure Chloe felt right at home in our world." Arthur puffed out his chest, stepping up beside his wife to reinforce their fictional dominance. "Our standards are exceptionally rigid," Arthur added, casting a look of undisguised contempt toward Garrett and the security team. "Though finding good help these days is damn near impossible. I've already had to reprimand the catering crew twice this morning, to say nothing of the garbage tech team cleaning up the network lines." Julian slid over, joining his parents to complete the delusional trinity. He placed a manicured hand on Marcus's arm. "Speaking of the tech crew," Julian lowered his voice to a conspiratorial, gossiping whisper, "if you happen to catch a glimpse of my dusty older sister in the service corridors today, I must apologize in advance. We took pity on her and allowed her pathetic little hardware repair shop to handle the pre-wedding network infrastructure and cable cleanup for free. We strictly instructed her to use the freight elevator and stay completely out of sight, but you know how the lower class gets sometimes, absolutely desperate for attention." Eleanor nodded sympathetically, playing the role of the heavily burdened mother. "It breaks my heart to see her crawling through vents pulling wires, but it was her choice. We just hope she doesn't embarrass us today." Marcus didn't even blink. He slowly and elegantly took a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and took a sip. A predatory gleam of anticipation flickered deep in his eyes, but Julian and Eleanor were far too self-absorbed to notice. "I am certain your sister will leave an incredibly lasting impression today, Julian," Marcus said, his voice smooth as silk. "I am very much looking forward to seeing the results of her work. I have a feeling she is going to completely clean this place out today." Across the lobby, Garrett discreetly adjusted the earpiece tucked into his right ear. The encrypted security channel clicked open. "Perimeter team reporting. a voice muttered over the radio frequency. "Principal target has just passed the main gates. Estimated arrival at the front entrance is 2 minutes." Garrett tapped his microphone twice in silent confirmation. He looked back at Arthur, Eleanor, and Julian, who were currently trying to order a senior event coordinator to wipe up a non-existent smudge on the marble floor. The pure arrogance of this group, standing in a fortress they didn't own, trashing staff they didn't hire, trying to impress a family they could never reach, was an absolute masterclass in psychological delusion. Garrett placed his hands behind his back, a dangerous knowing glint in his eyes. The invaders were completely clueless, drinking stolen champagne while complaining about the hired help. The real owner of the Apex Tower was pulling up the driveway, and this grand illusion was about to be permanently shattered. The string quartet transitioned into a light, classical melody as the final guests filed into the glass grand ballroom of the Apex Tower. The grand ballroom was a breathtaking display of architectural dominance. Suspended holographic crystal chandeliers cast a warm, amber glow across a sea of silk, velvet, and custom tuxedos. Arthur and Eleanor were exactly where they had always dreamed of being, stationed near the head table, loudly taking credit for the towering white orchids and imported linens. They were trying desperately to match the effortless elegance of Marcus's relatives, who conversed with the quiet confidence of people who actually belonged in these rooms. Julian sat at the absolute center of it all, completely drunk on his own smug satisfaction. Believing he had legally anchored himself to a senior auditor with a massive family fortune, he was ready to bask in the admiration of the Texas elite. And then, the massive mahogany and glass double doors at the main entrance were thrown wide open. Garrett, my chief of security, stood rigidly at the side, personally holding the door back. He wasn't doing it for the catering staff. He wasn't doing it for the regular guests. He was doing it because his employer had just arrived. I stepped into the grand ballroom. I wasn't wearing the scratchy, foul-smelling, cheap polyester uniform my mother had thrown at my chest the night before. I was wearing a masterpiece. It was a $12,000 bespoke midnight blue Tom Ford suit, hand-tailored from premier Italian wool and silk. Its razor-sharp lines were engineered to project absolute executive authority. Beneath the jacket was a crisp, white silk shirt, my cuffs secured by flawlessly square-cut diamond cufflinks. My hair was styled into a sleek, uncompromisingly sharp look. I didn't look like a blue-collar tech technician who had snuck into a billionaire's party. I looked like the woman who owned the building. The heels of my shoes clicked against the polished hardwood in a rhythmic, controlled cadence. A murmur began to ripple through the edges of the room. High society is trained to recognize power, and the sheer presence I radiated as I walked into that ballroom turned the heads of several prominent banking executives and corporate partners. Across the room, Eleanor was busy boasting about her fictional stock portfolio to one of Marcus's brothers, a federal judge. She glanced casually toward the entrance, likely expecting a wealthy latecomer. Her eyes locked onto me. The color drained from my mother's face so fast she looked physically ill. The crystal champagne flute in her hand trembled violently, spilling drops of expensive liquid onto the floor. Her brain was violently rejecting the reality of what she was looking at. She had expected me to sneak in through the loading dock, dragging discarded cables in the shadows, dusting servers in that humiliating black uniform. Instead, she saw a woman who commanded the room more than the groom himself. Without a word of explanation, Eleanor abandoned the judge mid-sentence. She practically sprinted across the ballroom, her champagne gown rustling aggressively as she navigated the maze of round tables. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic and vicious fury. She intercepted me just as I reached the edge of the dance floor. She didn't bother with a greeting. She lunged forward, sinking her French manicured acrylic nails brutally into my forearm, trying to drag me behind a massive floral arrangement and out of public view. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Eleanor hissed, her voice a frantic, venomous whisper. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, terrified that Chloe's family would recognize me. "I told you to use the freight elevator. Where is your uniform? Why are you dressed like this?" I looked down at her hand, clutching my expensive silk sleeve. I didn't pull away. I simply stared at her fingers with a cold, terrifying disdain that caused her to subconsciously loosen her grip. "I didn't think that uniform quite fit the dress code tonight, Mother," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "And as for the freight entrance, I prefer to walk through the front doors of my own building." "You are going to ruin everything," Eleanor growled, trying to use her body weight to shove me toward the hidden swinging doors that led to the catering kitchen. You are a low-level cable puller. You do not belong in this room. Get to the kitchen right now, change your clothes, and disappear before Marcus sees you. If you ruin your brother's wedding reception, I swear to God I will make you pay. She jammed her shoulder against mine, trying to force me backward. It was a pathetic, desperate display. She was so thoroughly consumed by her own web of lies that she was willing to physically assault her own daughter in the middle of a crowded ballroom just to maintain her fake social standing. I planted my feet and didn't move an inch. I opened my mouth to deliver a verbal strike that would freeze her in her tracks, but I didn't need to. A warm, booming voice carried beautifully across the dance floor. Elena, my God, you look absolutely stunning tonight. Eleanor froze, her entire body locked up instantly, as if she had been struck by lightning. Marcus strode across the polished floor, looking formidable in his custom navy suit. The seasoned legal titan didn't lower his voice. He didn't try to keep it down. He spoke with the polished authority of a man accustomed to commanding federal courtrooms and corporate boardrooms, ensuring every guest within a 50-foot radius heard him loud and clear. Marcus reached us, smoothly and deliberately peeling Eleanor's trembling hand off my arm. He pulled me into a warm, highly visible embrace, treating me with the exact level of respect reserved for a peer of equal executive status. Eleanor stood paralyzed, her mouth wide open, her eyes darting frantically between Marcus and me. The narrative she had spent months building was turning to ash right in front of her. She had told Marcus I was a pathetic, unambitious technician. Now, the powerful law firm partner was hugging me like a cherished old friend. I was worried you'd be stuck at the office handling that new Department of Defense data link project, Marcus continued, smiling down at me, completely ignoring the sheer terror on my mother's face. Chloe and I were just looking for you. Come with me. I had a seat reserved specifically for you at the VIP table right next to the bride's family. Eleanor let out a choking gasp. The VIP table? Eleanor stammered, her voice shaking with pure confusion and dread. Marcus, surely there's been a mistake. Elena is only here to help handle the back-end network troubleshooting. She's not a guest. Marcus turned his sharp, predatory gaze directly onto my mother. The warmth instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a chilling, corporate absolute zero. A mistake? Marcus asked, lofting an elegant eyebrow. Eleanor, please don't say something so ridiculous. Why on earth would the Chief Executive Officer of Aegis Quantum Solutions be handling back-end network troubleshooting? My mother stopped breathing entirely. The music in the background seemed to fade away. Marcus offered me his arm, turning his back on Eleanor and escorting me directly toward the head of the room, leaving my mother to suffocate in the wreckage of her own lies. Marcus guided me through the sea of elegantly dressed guests. We bypassed the standard seating arrangements, moving straight toward the absolute epicenter of the breathtaking ballroom. The VIP table was draped in heavy imported silk and decorated with towering white orchids. Chloe sat right at the center, surrounded by her formidable contingent of federal judges, corporate executives, and banking titans. When she caught sight of me approaching in my midnight blue suit, a sharp, knowing gleam flashed in her dark eyes. She stood up, pulling out the chair directly to her right. It was a seat of ultimate honor, placing me squarely at the core of the elite circle my parents had spent their entire lives trying to penetrate. From across the ballroom, I watched Eleanor stumble back toward her assigned table. She looked like she had just taken a physical blow to the chest. She grabbed Arthur's arm, her manicured nails digging into his tuxedo jacket as she whispered frantically into his ear. Arthur's brow furrowed, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson as he glared in my direction. He was clearly struggling to process how the daughter he dismissed as a college dropout had bypassed his defenses and infiltrated the highest tier of the guest list. The multi-course dinner proceeded with the precise choreography characteristic of high-end events. I enjoyed butter-poached lobster and vintage champagne, engaging in seamless high-level business conversation with Chloe's uncles, senior financial compliance executives. They were sharp, analytical men who highly appreciated my insights on federal data statutes. Every few minutes, I could feel the burning glare of my parents staring at the back of my head. They were trapped at the groom's family table, surrounded by people they desperately needed to impress. They were entirely unable to storm over and cause a scene without destroying the illusion they had worked so hard to project. As the service staff flawlessly cleared the final plates, the low murmur of conversation was cut short by the sharp, metallic ping of a spoon striking a crystal glass. The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward the center of the ballroom. Julian stood up. He was radiant, wearing his custom tuxedo funded entirely by the identity theft he had committed. He gripped a silver microphone with both hands, a wide, blindingly fake smile plastered across his face. He had finally reached the moment he had fantasized about. He had a captive audience of Dallas's wealthiest elite, ready to listen to his carefully engineered narrative of success. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate this magnificent union," Julian began, his voice echoing perfectly through the state-of-the-art acoustic system. He paused, tilting his head slightly to ensure the hired videographers caught his best angle. "I want to begin by thanking my incredible parents, Arthur and Eleanor." Julian turned toward them, placing a hand elegantly over his heart. "Arthur and Eleanor, your endless generosity and massive family wealth have been the bedrock of my entire life. You spared absolutely no expense for this day. You booked the Apex Tower, the premier, most expensive venue in the state, just to make my dreams come true. You taught me what true upper-class pedigree looks like." At his table, Arthur puffed out his chest, completely oblivious to Eleanor, who was currently breaking into a cold sweat beneath her thick foundation. He raised his glass to the room, basking in the hollow praise. He genuinely believed he was the master of this domain, entirely unaware that he was standing on a trapdoor I had personally installed. Julian then turned his focus toward Chloe. He looked down at her with a manufactured expression of adoration. "And to my brilliant, beautiful wife, Chloe. Tonight, we are joining two powerful families. We are merging two legacies of success and affluence. I cannot wait to build our massive empire together, using my capital and your brilliance." Chloe did not smile. She sat rigid, her dark eyes locked onto the man who was currently trying to use her bank accounts to bail out over $300,000 of high-interest debt. Her expression was completely unreadable to the average observer, but to Marcus and me, she looked like a predator waiting for the exact moment to snap her jaws shut. Julian wasn't satisfied with just inflating his own ego. His narcissism required a casualty. His eyes swept the room, landing directly on the VIP table. He saw me sitting right next to his new father-in-law. I caught the brief flash of absolute shock in his eyes as he registered my $12,000 custom suit, but his malice instantly overrode his logic. He clearly assumed that Marcus had pulled me to the head table out of some pathetic sense of charity. Julian gripped the microphone tight. He decided this was the perfect opportunity to put me in my place in front of his powerful new in-laws, cementing his dominance once and for all. "Finally, I want to raise a glass to my older sister, Elena," Julian announced, his voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet, condescending pity. He stepped away from the head table, ensuring every eye in the room followed his gaze directly to me. "Elena has always walked a very different path from the rest of our successful family," Julian continued, projecting a fake tone of sympathy to the crowd. "But we love her anyway, to my sister who handles the manual labor so the rest of us can shine. Thank you for doing the cleaning and wire pulling for my big day. We all know how hard you worked in those dusty server rooms to ensure a smooth data environment for my wealthy guests." The dead silence that slammed into the ballroom was suffocating. A collective murmur of deep discomfort rippled through the elegantly dressed crowd. In the world of old money and corporate elite, this kind of overt, tacky cruelty was deeply despised. It was a shocking display of low class. Several of Chloe's uncles exchanged looks of disgust. Marcus sat entirely motionless, sipping his champagne with the cold detachment of an executioner watching a condemned man tighten his own noose. My parents froze. Arthur's smug smile vanished, replaced by a sudden, terrifying realization. Julian was drawing massive public attention to the one person Eleanor had desperately tried to hide. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I remained comfortably in my chair, radiating absolute power. I reached out, pinched the slender stem of my crystal champagne flute, and raised it directly toward Julian. I didn't look like a humiliated technician. I looked like a king accepting a peasant's surrender. A slow, lethal, predatory smile spread across my face. Julian blinked. The fake, triumphant grin on his face faltered as he caught the pure, unadulterated authority in my eyes. He had expected me to cower, to cry, or to run out of the room in shame. My absolute defiance completely short-circuited his brain. And then, the heavy screech of a chair leg scraping against the floor cut through the quiet room. Chloe pushed back from the VIP table. She stood up. With slow, meticulous precision, she adjusted the train of her custom wedding gown. Her face was a mask of cold, unyielding auditor's rage. She looked at her groom with zero affection. She looked at him the way she would look at a hostile witness in a courtroom. Chloe left our table and marched directly toward the microphone, her steps deliberate and heavy. The sharp click of her heels against the floor sounded like the ticking of a metronome hitting zero. Julian watched her approach, a bright smile returning to his face. He was completely drunk on his own performance. He assumed she was coming to stand by his side, to wrap her arm around his, and to reinforce his arrogant words. He offered the silver microphone to her, his eyes shining with absolute delusion. Chloe reached out, but she didn't draw him in. With a smooth, clinical motion, she snatched the microphone right out of his hand. She took a step back, drawing a clear, chilling physical boundary between them. The entire ballroom held its breath. 300 elite guests waited in absolute silence for the bride to deliver her toast. Chloe looked out at the sea of faces. Her gaze swept past the stunned expressions of Arthur and Eleanor, past the probing looks of her corporate colleagues, and finally rested briefly on me. I gave her a microscopic nod of authorization. The prosecution was ready to deliver its closing argument. "Julian is right about one thing," Chloe began, her voice echoing flawlessly through the state-of-the-art audio system. The tone she used was not the warm, nervous register of a woman in love. It was the absolute zero frequency of an auditor dissecting a fraudulent entity in a boardroom. Honesty is key in a family. Transparency is the foundation of a true partnership. Julian smiled wider, nodding enthusiastically to the crowd, completely blind to the blade hovering over his neck. "Which is exactly why," Chloe's voice hardened into steel, "I cannot marry a man who is hiding $314,000 in unsecured high-interest debt." The smile vanished from Julian's face as if it had been wiped away with acid. A massive, collective gasp ripped through the ballroom. The clinking of silverware entirely ceased. Several of Marcus's banking colleagues bolted upright, their professional instincts instantly firing. Chloe didn't pause to let the shock settle. She drove the blade deeper, exposing every layer of his financial rot to the highest echelon of Dallas society. "I cannot marry a man whose supposedly successful decentralized hedge fund went bankrupt and was forfeited by the state 12 months ago," Chloe announced, her voice booming with absolute authority. "I cannot stand at an altar with a man who, just last week, wired $30,000 out of our joint wedding fund to pay off predatory lenders and collections agencies. I will never legally or morally bind myself to a con artist who viewed my bank accounts as a bailout package for his sinking ship." Julian lost all motor function. His hands dropped to his sides. The massive glass of champagne he had been gesturing with slipped through his fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor with a loud, humiliating crash. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny it, to spin a desperate web of lies, but his vocal cords were paralyzed. He stood frozen in his custom tuxedo, stripped bare in front of the exact people he had intended to exploit. At the groom's family table, absolute chaos erupted. Eleanor gasped, slamming her hands over her mouth, her face turning an alarming shade of gray. Arthur exploded from his chair, his face turning a dangerous crimson. "Chloe, what is the meaning of this?" Arthur roared, his voice cracking with panicked fury. "This is a highly inappropriate joke. You are publicly humiliating my son. Give him back the microphone immediately." Chloe turned slowly, locking her dark, furious eyes onto Arthur. The sheer weight of her gaze stopped him dead in his tracks. Chloe was not a woman you could yell down. She was a woman who routinely handed corporate fraudsters over to federal prosecutors. "I am not joking, Arthur," Chloe replied, her voice dropping to a lethal frequency that demanded absolute silence. "And my investigation into your son's finances is only the tip of the iceberg of what I discovered this week." Chloe took a step closer to the edge of the stage, looking down at my parents' table like a judge delivering an inescapable sentence. "Furthermore, I cannot marry into a family that stole their oldest daughter's social security number to illegally finance the very reception you are sitting in right now," Chloe announced. The ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked whispers and sharp intake breaths. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a deep, elegant look of satisfaction on his face. I simply crossed my legs and watched my family burn. Arthur staggered backward, his knees buckling against his chair. Eleanor began to hyperventilate, clutching her pearl necklace for dear life as the walls of her fictional reality collapsed around her. "Let me make this perfectly clear to everyone in this room," Chloe continued, ensuring the acoustic system carried her voice to the furthest corners of the tower. "Every single white orchid on these tables, the imported silk linens, the vintage champagne in your glasses, and the custom tuxedo the groom is currently wearing were all paid for with a federal felony. She leveled a long, accusing finger directly at Arthur and Eleanor. Just 2 days ago, these two individuals used the stolen identity of the very daughter they just publicly mocked to secure a fraudulent $150,000 loan. They thought they could commit wire fraud from the comfort of their suburban living room sofa and leave Elena to face total financial ruin. They thought they were clever. They thought they were untouchable. Julian was sobbing now, heavy, ugly tears ruining his expensive makeup. He reached out, his hand trembling as he tried to grasp the hem of Chloe's custom gown. "Chloe, babe, please," he sobbed, his voice reduced to a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "You don't understand. My parents just wanted everything to be perfect for us. We can explain." Chloe took a smooth step back, looking down at his outstretched hand with absolute disgust. She didn't scream. She didn't raise her voice. She delivered the final blow with the chilling precision of someone who had completely severed all emotional ties. "There is nothing to explain, Julian," Chloe said, her voice carrying a terrifying sense of finality. "I am a senior auditor. I do not marry toxic liabilities. I do not marry felons. And I sure as hell will not marry a man who treats his own flesh and blood like garbage to feed his pathetic vanity." She turned her back on him. Walking to the edge of the stage, she deliberately set the silver microphone down on the nearest table and marched straight back to the VIP section. She sat right next to me, smoothed her skirt, and picked up her champagne glass. The silence inside the grand ballroom was apocalyptic. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. The elite guests stared at my parents and my brother with absolute, unfiltered revulsion. Arthur and Eleanor were cornered. The exit felt miles away, and the judgmental glare of 300 powerful witnesses pinned them straight to the floor. The grand illusion was entirely gone, replaced by the ugly, undeniable truth of their criminal actions. The apocalyptic silence held for 10 seconds before the entire ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. The collective shock of 300 high society guests instantly devolved into furious whispers and sharp exclamations. Several banking executives stood up from their seats, pulling out their phones to contact their respective risk management departments. They had just been told the champagne they were drinking was funded by federal identity theft, and their tolerance for being associated with criminals was absolute zero. At the groom's table, the facade of the perfect family violently disintegrated. Julian collapsed onto the floor, his expensive custom tuxedo pooling around him like a deflated parachute as he buried his face in his hands and wailed. Eleanor was hyperventilating so hard she was frantically clawing at the neckline of her gown, her eyes darting wildly around the room, searching for a single sympathetic face and finding nothing. But my father, Arthur, reacted with a volatile mixture of pure denial and blinding rage. Arthur could not process the reality of his public execution. His ego, inflated by decades of lies and financial manipulation, snapped completely. His face turned a dangerous shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged above the collar of his rented tuxedo as he locked his eyes onto Chloe and me, sitting perfectly composed at the VIP table. "You arrogant, crazy bitch," Arthur roared, his gravelly voice cutting through the rising noise of the crowd. He strode aggressively across the dance floor, pointing a shaking finger straight at Chloe. "You've lost your mind. You're letting that lying blue-collar mechanic wash your brain. She's a jealous, bitter dropout who has hated her brother for 15 years. She forged those documents just to ruin the best day of Julian's life." Chloe didn't even blink. She calmly took a sip of her champagne, completely unfazed by the screaming man rushing our table. Marcus mirrored his daughter's posture, watching my father with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a dying insect. "I am the host of this event." Arthur continued to shriek, spitting as he spoke, desperately trying to establish dominance in a room that had already condemned him. "I paid for this venue. I demand respect in this room." Arthur whipped his head around, scanning the edges of the grand ballroom. He locked eyes with Garrett, the massive head of my private security team, who was standing with his arms crossed by the mahogany entrance doors. Arthur pointed forcefully at Garrett, treating the highly trained former military contractor like a disobedient servant. "You guard!" Arthur bellowed, his voice cracking with hysterical authority. "I want you to remove these two women right now. Throw this ungrateful technician and this delusional auditor out the back door. They are trespassing on a private party. Remove them immediately or I'll have your job." The ballroom fell into a tense, quiet anticipation. The wealthy guests watched the security team, waiting for the guards to either intervene or call the local authorities to calm the screaming father down. I set my crystal champagne glass back on the table, the sharp clink of the glass cutting through the lingering noise. I stood up, smoothing down the front of my midnight blue custom suit. I didn't run. I stepped around the VIP table with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator that had successfully cornered its prey. I walked straight into the center of the dance floor, placing myself directly between Arthur and the exit. My father glared at me, his fists clenched, fully expecting me to cower or argue against his delusional narrative. Garrett pushed off the wall he was leaning against. The massive security chief strode across the polished hardwood floor, his heavy tactical boots making a rhythmic, intimidating sound. 2 other security officers detached from the perimeter, falling in step right behind him. Arthur puffed out his chest, a sickening smirk of triumph flashing briefly across his purple face. He genuinely thought his aggressive command had worked. He thought the hired muscle was coming to grab me by the collar and drag me out. Garrett bypassed Arthur completely. He didn't even give my father a glance. The towering security chief stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. He snapped his boots together, placed his hands behind his back, and bowed his head deeply, with absolute respect. "What are your orders, boss?" Garrett's deep voice carried perfectly across the silent ballroom. Arthur physically recoiled, stumbling back a step. The triumphant smirk melted off his face, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. He looked at Garrett, then at me, his brain violently short-circuiting as he tried to process why the head of security for the premier venue in the state was addressing his cable-pulling daughter as the commander-in-chief. I reached into the inner pocket of my hand-tailored suit jacket. I pulled out a folded legal document printed on heavy watermarked parchment. I walked over to the head table where Eleanor was still clutching her face, hyperventilating. I dropped the heavy document directly into the center of the table, right next to the towering orchid centerpieces. "This is the master deed and corporate acquisition file," I announced, raising my voice so every influential guest in the room could hear the final, devastating truth. "I don't just do network infrastructure, Arthur. I do infrastructure acquisition. I am the founder and CEO of Aegis Quantum Solutions. I bought the entire conglomerate that manages this property 30 days ago. I own the Apex Tower." Eleanor let out a sharp, choking gasp, staring at the legal deed as if it were a bomb about to detonate. Arthur swayed on his feet, the color draining from his face so fast he looked like a ghost in a rented tuxedo. The narrative weapon they had used against me for a decade crumbled to ash in front of them. They hadn't been mocking a pathetic technician. They had been trashing the owner of the fortress while standing inside her gates. "And as the legal owner of this establishment," I continued, my voice dropping to a lethal absolute 0, "I tolerate 0 federal felons occupying my real estate." I turned my gaze back to Garrett. The security chief stood at absolute attention, waiting for my command. "I want these trespassers removed immediately," I smoothly commanded, gesturing toward my father, my mother, and my sobbing brother. "Eject them from my property right now. If they resist, use any physical force necessary." "Understood, ma'am," Garrett replied, a cold, incredibly satisfied smile spreading across his lips. He signaled to the other security personnel. 6 massive tactical agents instantly detached from the perimeter, closing in on the head table with absolute precision, completely surrounding my family. The endgame had officially arrived. Garrett and his men formed an impenetrable wall of muscle around the table. Arthur puffed out his chest, attempting to physically shove a guard twice his size. The agent didn't even shift his weight, easily blocking my father with a single forearm. Eleanor pressed her back flat against the silk-draped table, clutching her pearl necklace so tight the string looked ready to snap. She darted her eyes frantically toward the exits, searching for a miracle escape route that simply didn't exist. But just before Garrett could order his men to physically drag them out, a sharp siren cut through the heavy air of the estate. The distinct screeching wail of police cruisers echoed up the long, winding driveway. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand ballroom, casting an intense, alternating glow over the crystal chandeliers and the terrified faces of my parents. I hadn't just called security. My chief corporate litigator, Garrett, had executed the final phase of our strategy exactly on schedule. The moment Chloe finished speaking, my legal team had transmitted the forensic dossier, complete with the forged loan documents, bank security footage, and the IP tracking logs, directly to his contacts at the federal prosecutor's office. A task force of Texas law enforcement had been staging just outside the iron gates of the tower, waiting strictly for my signal. The heavy mahogany doors of the main entrance burst open for the second time tonight. A squad of uniformed state troopers and federal agents flooded into the ballroom, led by a senior detective in a dark trench coat. The high society guests parted immediately, clearing a wide path across the polished hardwood floor. Not a single person uttered a word of protest. The elite banking executives and corporate titans simply watched in cold, judgmental silence as law enforcement closed in on the fraudsters. The detective stopped directly in front of the head table, completely ignoring the imported floral arrangements and expensive champagne. He looked at my parents with the cold, assessing gaze of a man who dealt with criminals every single day. "Arthur and Eleanor Miller," the detective announced, his voice carrying the unyielding weight of federal authority. "You are both under arrest for federal identity theft, wire fraud, and bank forgery." Eleanor let out a blood-curdling, choking shriek. "No!" she screamed, her voice cracking in pure hysteria. "This is a mistake. We belong here. We have money. Tell them, Arthur. Tell them we are hosting a wedding." Arthur couldn't speak. The arrogance that had sustained him his entire life evaporated in an instant. He stared at the silver handcuffs being unclipped from the nearest officer's belt, his jaw trembling uncontrollably. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," the arresting officer commanded, stepping forward. When Arthur hesitated, the officer forcefully grabbed his arm, spun him around, and locked the cold stainless steel cuffs over his rented tuxedo sleeves. The sharp, metallic click echoed loudly in the quiet room. Eleanor tried to pull away, weeping violently, but a female officer quickly subdued her, pinning her arms behind her back to secure the cuffs. My mother's exquisite custom champagne gown was instantly downgraded to the uniform of a common felon heading to central booking. Julian, who had been curled up on the floor, finally processed the catastrophic reality of his situation. His parents were going to federal prison. His fund was dead. He was drowning in $314,000 of predatory debt, and the only safety net he had left was walking away from him. He scrambled onto his hands and knees, his expensive tuxedo tangling around his legs, making him look utterly desperate and pathetic. He crawled directly toward the VIP table where Chloe still stood tall. "Chloe, please," Julian sobbed, reaching out to grab the train of her custom wedding dress. "You have to help them. Your father is a high-powered attorney. You can make this go away. I love you. I'll do whatever you want. Just please don't leave me like this." Chloe looked down at the man who had tried to bleed her dry to save his own sinking ship. She didn't yell. She didn't show a microscopic ounce of pity. The expression on her face was pure, clinical disgust. "You don't love me," Chloe said, her voice dropping into a flat, devastating monotone. "You love my bank account. You loved the idea of using my family's legacy to cover up your own failures. Never contact me again. First thing Monday morning, my legal team will serve you with a restraining order and a civil lawsuit for the unauthorized wire transfers from our joint account." Julian let out a broken, agonizing wail, collapsing flat onto the floor. He buried his face in the imported silk tablecloth, weeping uncontrollably as the illusion of his billionaire lifestyle was permanently reduced to ash. Chloe didn't give him another look. She turned to her father. Marcus stood elegantly, his posture impeccably straight, his navy suit completely unwrinkled by the chaos around them. He looked down at the sobbing groom and the handcuffed parents, giving a slow, deeply contemptuous shake of his head. Chloe wrapped her arm around her father's. Together they began their walk down the center aisle of the ballroom. They moved with effortless dignity, carrying the immense pride of a family that refused to be tainted by scammers. They walked right through the doors, leaving the spectacular wreckage behind them without looking back a single time. The detective read my parents their Miranda rights before the officers forcefully escorted them toward the exit. Eleanor was crying so hysterically that her makeup had smeared into ugly, dark tracks down her face. Arthur kept his head low, utterly broken and publicly humiliated in front of the exact high society crowd he had spent his life trying to impress. I stood in the center of the dance floor, the diamonds on my cuffs catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. I watched law enforcement march my parents out of the grand venue they had tried to steal, wearing the handcuffs they had entirely earned on their own. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly clean. With a highly fluid motion, I signed my name at the bottom of the final acquisition agreement, the dark ink flowing effortlessly from the platinum tip of my fountain pen. I closed the heavy leather binder and slid it to the edge of my obsidian desk. The paperwork officially finalized the largest corporate merger in the history of Aegis Quantum Solutions. The past was permanently wiped clean, and the future required my absolute focus. The private executive elevator gave a soft, melodic chime, breaking the quiet hum of the suite. The heavy metal doors slid open, and Marcus and Chloe stepped into my penthouse office. Chloe looked completely transformed. The heavy, exhausted weight she had carried during her brief engagement to my brother was entirely gone. She now radiated the razor-sharp, unyielding confidence of a senior auditor at the absolute peak of her career. Following the spectacular demolition at the Apex Tower, I had officially hired her firm to manage the financial compliance for Aegis Quantum's nationwide expansion. Marcus walked beside her, looking formidable as ever in a custom-tailored teal suit. He carried a sleek velvet box under his arm and his signature leather briefcase in his hand. His law firm had just finished structuring the back-end legal architecture of our massive new acquisition, cementing a powerhouse partnership that dominated the southwestern tech and data sectors. We had built an empire based on mutual respect, completely devoid of the shallow vanity that had destroyed my parents. I hear the final signatures went strictly according to plan, Marcus said, his voice filled with genuine warmth as he walked across the plush carpet. I hope you're ready to celebrate, Elena. We didn't spend the last 6 months fighting through federal antitrust reviews and hostile bidding wars just to drink tap water. Chloe chuckled, setting her briefcase down on a leather guest chair. She took the velvet box from her father and popped it open, revealing a bottle of vintage champagne. It was an incredibly rare, expensive label, the exact kind of true luxury my father had spent his entire life pretending he could afford. The legal and audit filings are officially stamped and submitted to the Federal Registry, Chloe announced, expertly popping the cork. Aegis Quantum has officially absorbed the largest corporate data center cluster in the city. You are completely untouchable now, Elena. The board is absolutely ecstatic. I stood up from behind my desk and walked over to the custom bar in the corner of the office. I pulled out 3 heavy crystal champagne flutes, lining them up on the marble surface. I couldn't have executed this takeover without your firm's architecture, Marcus, I replied, taking the bottle from Chloe. You bypassed those antitrust clauses perfectly. You earned every single dime of that retainer. Chloe poured the golden, effervescent liquid into the remaining glasses, handing one to Marcus. She looked at me, her dark eyes reflecting a deep, unwavering loyalty. Working with you has been the absolute highlight of my career, Chloe said, her tone turning deeply sincere. 3 months ago, I was standing on the edge of a cliff, completely blindfolded, ready to legally bind myself to a financial parasite. You and my father took the blindfold off. You saved my life, Elena. Managing your corporate audit contract is an absolute honor. Marcus raised his crystal flute, catching the glint of the setting sun through the panoramic windows. In the world of high finance, you meet countless people wearing expensive masks, Marcus said, his piercing gaze meeting mine. People who use deception to steal what they lack the talent to build themselves. But true power lies in absolute transparency. It's about building a foundation so deep and so honest that no storm can ever shake it. He raised his glass a little higher. To loyalty, Marcus toasted, and to the unvarnished truth. To the truth, Chloe echoed firmly. To the truth, I agreed. We clinked our glasses together. The crisp, resonant chime of the crystal was the exact opposite of the heavy, suffocating tension that had poisoned the engagement luncheon just a month ago. There were no hidden agendas in this room, no fake smiles and no desperate posturing to impress anyone. There was only real success shared among equals. Marcus and Chloe walked over to the spacious lounge area to review the initial press release for our merger. Holding my champagne, I slowly walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The sun was beginning to set over Dallas, casting a stunning array of gold, amber, and deep purple streaks across the vast city skyline. The city looked expansive and alive, a network of endless possibilities stretching all the way to the horizon. Thousands of lights were beginning to flicker in the towering skyscrapers, pushing back the gathering twilight. I pressed my hand against the cool glass, looking down at the distant streets below. I thought about the word my mother had thrown at me like a weapon for 15 years. She called me a low-level worker, a cable puller. She tried to use those titles to strip away my dignity, hoping to keep me small, silent, and ashamed. She genuinely believed that working with my hands to earn a living was a permanent stain on my character. I took a slow sip of my champagne, letting the crisp, exquisite flavor bloom. I didn't hate the title anymore. In fact, I embraced it completely. They called me a technician who cleaned up the basements, and they were absolutely right. I built my empire by taking over broken, neglected legacy systems and stripping away the rot. I specialized in identifying structural decay and rooting it out. But my greatest achievement wasn't fixing corporate data structures. My greatest achievement was applying that exact same protocol to my own life. I audited the toxic, parasitic waste that was infecting my existence, and I cleared it out completely. I ran a virus scan on my environment, purging the people who only viewed me as a scapegoat and an ATM. I swept away the lies, the manipulation, and the suffocating cruelty that my parents and my brother tried to bring through my front door. I was standing in my own penthouse, surrounded by true allies, holding the legal deeds to a multi-million-dollar empire that nobody could ever take away from me. I started with a pile of broken cables and abandoned hard drives, and I ended up owning the skyline. The past had been scrubbed clean. The trash had been taken out. I looked out over the brilliant city, feeling an absolute sense of peace, leaving nothing ahead of me but an incredibly bright, spotless future.